Find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop. If you're in bed, pull the covers a little closer, settle your head, and let your body tell you it's done for the day. Tonight we're going back, 1,000 years back, give or take, to a stretch of Scottish moorland where 4 people stood arguing about the future of magic and built something that would outlast every war, every dark lord, and every attempt to tear it down. This is the complete history of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. We'll start before the castle existed, when the land was just cold and quiet and empty. We'll move through the founders and their falling out, through centuries of headmasters and hidden chambers and enchanted ceilings and moving staircases that nobody ever bothered to explain. We'll watch the castle get darker, then brighter, then very nearly destroyed, and then rebuilt. And somewhere along the way, if sleep finds you, that's exactly what it's supposed to do. If you enjoy this and want more stories like it, the full history of the Ministry, the complete lore of the Marauders, the untold centuries before Harry Potter's parents were born, subscribe and turn on the bell. There are dozens of hours already waiting for you, and if you fall asleep before I tell you to, good. Part 1. The Land Before the School Scotland, approximately 993 AD. Long before there was a castle, there was a plateau. It sat above a valley in the Scottish Highlands, on the northern side of a loch that stayed black and cold in every season. The plateau was wide enough for a small village, ringed on 3 sides by old-growth forest, and elevated just enough that a person standing on its southern edge could see across miles of purple, heather in every direction. It was the kind of place that made people feel watched. The local Muggle farmers avoided it. Their children had nightmares near it. Travellers on the road below learned, over generations, to walk a little faster when the plateau was in view. Why it felt that way, nobody could say exactly. The land had been used by witches and wizards for centuries before any permanent structure was built there. The Scottish magical community had long held outdoor gatherings on that plateau, ritual assemblies, dueling competitions, the occasional illegal experiment that benefited from remote location. The spot had something the practitioners called a resonance, a quality in the air that made spellwork cleaner, more precise, more powerful. Theories about why ranged from underground mineral deposits to a ley line convergence to the accumulated magical residue of centuries of practice. None of those theories was ever settled. What mattered was that every witch or wizard who stood there felt it within 30 seconds. The loch below was already old when the first wizard set foot on the plateau. The giant squid had been living in it for at least 300 years by 993 AD. Though nobody was keeping careful records at the time, the squid was enormous, reclusive, and apparently indifferent to human activity. It would eventually become a kind of unofficial mascot of the school, occasionally visible from the shore on warm afternoons, a dark shape moving 30 feet below the surface. Students would spend their whole 7 years at Hogwarts without ever getting more than a glimpse. The forests on the plateau's northern and western edges were already strange. The trees were older than the records of the region, their canopy thick enough to block out Scottish sunlight even at midsummer. Centaurs had been living in those woods for as long as any centaur alive could remember, and centaurs have very long memories. They were not interested in sharing the forest with a school, a position they maintained with remarkable consistency for the next 1,000 years. The centaur community's relationship with Hogwarts would always be the same: cold, proud, occasionally cooperative in the face of shared catastrophe, never warm. They watched the castle get built from the tree line. They watched everything that followed from the same position. What the founders were looking for when they found this place was exactly what it offered: power, remoteness, and defensibility. Magic could be practiced here without Muggle observation. The isolation was natural rather than manufactured. The elevation gave a clear view of any approach. And that resonance, that quality in the air that sharpened spells, meant the building they raised would work harder than a building built anywhere else. They arrived separately because they always did everything separately at first. Trust among the 4 of them was real but cautious, the way trust tends to be between people who are all, in their own different ways, exceptional. Godric Gryffindor came from a valley town in the West Country. the son of a muggle-born mother and a wizard father, and he had been thinking about the school for years before any site was chosen. He had grown up watching muggle-born children discover their magic with no one to teach them, no framework to put it in, no protection from the fear that discovery caused. His motivation for building the school was straightforward. Every magical child deserved training. The argument for who deserved it would become, within a decade, the thing that broke the founders apart. Helga Hufflepuff arrived from the Welsh valleys, and she had already spent 20 years teaching anyone who would let her, formally, informally, through apprenticeships and travelling instruction and hospitality extended to magical wanderers who had nowhere else to go. She had taught more students by the time the 4 founders met than the other 3 combined. Her claim on the school was practical experience. If Gryffindor had the fire, Hufflepuff had the architecture. Rowena Ravenclaw was from Scotland itself, and some versions of the story place her family seat within a few days' ride of the plateau they eventually chose. She had designed the magical architecture of the school in her head for years, working out theoretical problems in a series of notebooks that no one else could fully follow. The enchantments she planned were in some cases unprecedented. The moving staircases, the enchanted ceiling in the Great Hall, the castle's fundamental ability to reconfigure itself in response to need. These weren't improvised. They were Ravenclaw's designs, solved on paper before a single stone was laid. Salazar Slytherin came from the East Anglian Fenlands, old wizarding stock on both sides, Parseltongue as a birthright passed down through his mother's line. He was the most technically skilled duelist of the 4, arguably the most gifted at magic on a spell-by-spell basis, and he had been the most skeptical about the project. He came around to it eventually, though his reasons for joining were always a little different from the others. He wanted a school where magic would be done properly, with rigor and seriousness and no dilution of standards. What he meant by dilution, he wasn't entirely honest about in those early years. The 4 of them stood on the plateau on a September day around 993 AD and made the decision together. Building started almost immediately. Part 2, the construction 993, 1000 AD approximately. The castle did not go up the way Muggle buildings go up. There were no scaffolding teams, no supply wagons arriving from distant quarries, no months of foundation work before anything was visible above ground. Magical construction in 10th century Britain worked by a combination of conjuration, transfiguration, and structural enchantment, and the founders had the skill to use all 3. Stones rose into walls. Towers assembled themselves from the top down, which looked strange but was structurally sounder than working upward when you were working at speed. The Great Hall went up in 3 days, but the construction was not purely magical in the sense of being effortless. The founders had the same arguments that any 4 people with different priorities will have when building something they all intend to inhabit. Ravenclaw's architectural plans were brilliant, and also, according to Gryffindor, baffling. Why did the staircases need to move? Because, Ravenclaw explained with some patience, a castle that can rearrange itself is harder to siege than a castle that cannot. The defensive logic was sound. Gryffindor conceded the point and spent 2 weeks helping to enchant 14 staircases, muttering the entire time. The Great Hall ceiling was Ravenclaw's work too, and it remains one of the most underappreciated pieces of magic in the wizarding world. The enchantment creates a perfect, dynamic reflection of the sky outside. Cloud movement, weather, time of day, in real time, across a stone ceiling 90 feet up. For 1,000 years that ceiling has shown every Scottish storm, every summer evening, every midwinter darkness. Generations of students have stared up at it during meals, without thinking about the technical accomplishment it represents. Hermione Granger read about it in Hogwarts, a history before she ever arrived, and said to anyone who would listen that it wasn't real, which was correct in a technical sense and entirely missed the point. Hufflepuff supervised the kitchen installation, which was considerably more consequential than it sounds. The kitchens at Hogwarts were designed to be operated by house elves from their founding, and the magical integration of the cooking infrastructure, the self-stirring cauldrons, the temperature-controlled storage, the serving passage that connected the kitchens directly to the tables above, required months of careful enchantment. The food at Hogwarts was excellent for 1,000 years. That was Hufflepuff's work. Slytherin designed the dungeons. This was partly practical. And the dungeons provided the natural cold temperatures that potions required, and Slytherin was the most accomplished potions practitioner of the four. He also designed the Slytherin common room in those depths, a long, low chamber beneath the loch, with thin windows that looked out into the water. On overcast days, the light through those windows was a deep greenish grey, the colour of cold water in winter. He built his house's home to feel like somewhere private and removed, separate from the rest of the castle, in ways that were not just physical. The students who would come after him would spend 7 years in those low, green-lit rooms and come out knowing, in some inarticulate way, that they were different. The Chamber of Secrets was built during this same period, though the other 3 founders did not know about it. More on that later. The library was Ravenclaw's domain, and she filled it initially with her own collection, several hundred volumes spanning transfiguration, charms, arithmancy, astronomy, and magical theory. Gryffindor contributed a significant collection of texts on defense and dueling. Hufflepuff added herbology, healing, and what would eventually be classified as magical creatures. Slytherin's collection, the oldest text, some in languages that were already dying in the 10th century, went to the library's general shelves, though a portion of his more esoteric volumes went somewhere else. The library grew over the centuries into the largest collection of magical knowledge in Britain, eventually containing hundreds of thousands of volumes. Madame Pince, who became librarian in the 20th century, treated every one of them as personal property and regarded students as a nuisance the books were forced to endure. The astronomy tower went up last, because Ravenclaw insisted on getting the orientation exactly right. She calculated for weeks. The finished tower's observation platform gave a clear sightline to the northern sky, unobstructed by any other part of the castle, at an angle that made it possible to read star positions without correction. Students would take astronomy for the next 10 centuries on that platform, cold and squinting into their telescopes on clear October nights, and most of them would not appreciate what went into getting it right. By approximately the year 1000, Hogwarts was built, and it was smaller then than it would eventually become. The castle that Harry Potter attended 1,000 years later had grown considerably through additions, renovations, and the occasional structural explosion that necessitated rebuilding. But the core of the school, the Great Hall, the towers, the dungeons, the staircases, was there from the beginning. 442 students arrived for the first term. Some had been waiting years. Part 3. The Four Houses Year 1. Hogwarts, approximately 1000 AD. The sorting hat was Godric Gryffindor's hat. This is a detail that tends to get lost in the way the story is usually told, where the hat is simply a feature of the school, ancient and inevitable. But it was not ancient when it was made. Gryffindor took his own hat, a pointed, worn, slightly battered thing he'd been wearing for years, and with the help of the other 3 founders, transferred into it the accumulated knowledge, judgment, and personality of all 4 of them. The enchantment was unprecedented. The hat would read each incoming student's mind and assess their qualities, compare those qualities against the founders' collective wisdom about what each house valued, and assign the student to the appropriate home. The hat's first sorting took about 3 hours. There were 442 students. None of them had done this before, and the hat had some opinions it wanted to share. Its opening song went on for 11 verses. Several students in the back of the Great Hall sat down on the floor. The 4 houses were not, at the beginning, as rigidly defined as they would eventually become. The founders had real philosophical differences about what each house should prioritize, but those differences were about emphasis, not exclusion. Gryffindor valued bravery, certainly, and directness, and the willingness to act in the face of uncertainty. But he had not intended his house to be synonymous with recklessness, and he had not intended it to produce generation after generation of people who confused stubbornness with courage. Hufflepuff's house was built on a premise that took centuries to fully appreciate. Hard work and loyalty were not lesser virtues than bravery or cleverness or ambition. She was the only founder who explicitly said she would take all who came, regardless of particular aptitude, and teach them well, Anne. This was sometimes read, even by Hufflepuff students, as evidence that their house was a default, somewhere for the students who weren't quite brave, enough or clever enough or ambitious enough for the other three. That reading was wrong, and Hufflepuff herself would have said so with some heat. Ravenclaw's house valued learning and wit and the specific pleasures of knowing things. This was sometimes mistaken for valuing academic achievement, which is different. A student could have perfect marks and miss entirely what Ravenclaw cared about, which was the quality of curiosity itself, the genuine appetite for understanding, the willingness to hold a problem and turn it over until it opened. Luna Lovegood was a Ravenclaw. Hermione Granger, to everyone's mild surprise, was not. Slytherin's house valued cunning and ambition, and the willingness to use both in pursuit of something. He also valued blood purity, which he did not announce clearly in the early years, but which shaped how his house was built and who he wanted in it. The argument between Gryffindor and Slytherin on this point was the first serious crack in the founders' working relationship, and it opened almost immediately. The specifics of the argument, as recorded in later accounts, came down to one question: should Muggle-born students be admitted? Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, and Ravenclaw said yes. Slytherin said no. Part 4. The Schism, approximately 1013 AD. They taught together for roughly a decade before the tension became irresolvable. Slytherin's position had not been secret exactly, but it had been managed. In the early years, he was outvoted 3-1 on admissions decisions, and he accepted this with visible displeasure and moved on. He was not wrong that the other three were aware of his views and chose the school over the disagreement. So did he. For 10 years. What changed is not entirely clear from the surviving records. Some accounts suggest a specific incident, a confrontation with a Muggle-born student that went badly, or a dispute with Gryffindor that escalated past recovery. Others suggest there was no single moment, only a gradual hardening of a position that had always been there, combined with the accumulated frustration of being outnumbered on something he cared about more than the other three understood. What is clear is that Slytherin eventually told the other founders he wanted Muggle-born students excluded from Hogwarts. He argued it on practical grounds. The teaching was harder with students of mixed background. The standards were harder to maintain. The culture of the school was being diluted. These were not his real reasons. His real reason was that he believed magical blood was superior to Muggle blood, and that a school that mixed the two was corrupting something he considered valuable. The other three declined. Slytherin left. He is said to have cursed the defense against the dark arts position on his way out, which would explain why no teacher held the job for more than a year between the 1930s and 1997. Though this is a legend rather than a confirmed fact. Anne. What is confirmed is that before he left, he went back to the dungeons and finished something he had started years earlier, a hidden chamber deep beneath the school, accessible only to his heir, containing a basilisk he had raised and concealed, the Chamber of Secrets. He left it as a legacy, or a warning, or perhaps just a weapon he never got to use himself. The other three founders learned about the chamber much later. By then, Slytherin was gone, and there was nothing to be done. His house remained. The Hat still sorted students into Slytherin because the qualities Slytherin had valued, cunning, resourcefulness, ambition, determination, were real qualities that real students had, and those students still deserved a home. The house that remained after Slytherin left became something the man himself might not have entirely recognized. Still proud, still private, still producing more than its share of dark wizards, but also producing Merlin, and Severus Snape, and Regulus Black, and dozens of others who chose something other than what Slytherin had built toward. After Slytherin's departure, the three remaining founders ran the school together for another 30 years or so. Gryffindor and Ravenclaw both died at Hogwarts. Hufflepuff may have retired. The records become thin in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, and it is difficult to say exactly when or how she left. The school continued without them, passing into the hands of a succession of headmasters who would keep it running, keep it changing, and occasionally burn small parts of it to the ground. Part 5. The early centuries, 1050, 1400 AD. The centuries after the founders are the least documented period in Hogwarts history. This is partly because record-keeping was inconsistent before the Ministry of Magic was established in 1707. It is partly because many early records were kept in languages that later required translation, and several key documents were lost in a fire in the 13th century. And it is partly because the years between 1050 and 1400 were relatively stable for Hogwarts, and history tends not to preserve stability as carefully as it preserves catastrophe. What we know is that the school grew. The student population expanded as word of Hogwarts spread through the British magical community and eventually beyond. The castle grew with it, towers added, wings extended, the library doubled and doubled again. The grounds were established in their more or less permanent form. The vegetable gardens, Hufflepuff's original planting beds long since expanded, the greenhouses, the Quidditch pitch, the training grounds, the boathouse at the loch's edge, where first years arrived by water on their first night. The tradition of arriving by boat on the first night was established early and never abandoned. Every class of first-year students made that crossing in the dark. 11-year-olds in small boats, lanterns at the prow, the black loch on all sides, the castle lit above them for the first time. The experience was designed to be overwhelming, and it worked. Students who graduated at 17 and went on to careers spanning decades could describe in precise detail the night they crossed the loch and saw Hogwarts for the first time. Some of them cried, several capsized. The giant squid was helpful during capsizings. This became one of its unofficial functions. It had lived in that loch long enough to understand that small panicking humans required gentle retrieval rather than investigation. The Whomping Willow was planted much later, in 1971, for specific reasons relating to a specific student, which we'll get to, but the Forbidden Forest was old by any standard, and the centaurs who lived there maintained their dignified hostility to the school across every century without variation. They came out of the forest twice in recorded history to assist in genuine emergencies, and both times went straight back in afterward. The forest itself grew stranger over the centuries as the magical saturation of the grounds increased. Thestrals arrived sometime in the medieval period and stayed. Unicorns were spotted in increasing numbers from the 1200s onward. Acromantula arrived in 1942, brought by a student named Hagrid who had found an egg and not thought the situation through. Quidditch arrived at Hogwarts in the 11th century, shortly after the game was codified by the Wigtown Wanderers incident of 1050, and it never left. The first Hogwarts Quidditch pitch was much smaller than the one Harry Potter played on. The bleachers were wooden and frequently damaged by weather. The bludgers had not yet been fully standardized and caused several injuries per game that would not be considered acceptable by later safety standards. None of this reduced the students' enthusiasm. Quidditch at Hogwarts became what it would remain for a millennium, the primary organizing social drama of school life, the source of more arguments than any academic subject, and the thing most students mentioned first when asked what they remembered about school. The curriculum solidified gradually over these centuries. The original 7 subjects, transfiguration, charms, potions, herbology, defense against the dark arts, astronomy, and history of magic, were all present from the beginning, though their precise content and pedagogical approach shifted considerably over time. Divination was added to the curriculum in the medieval period, largely at the insistence of a headmistress named Hereward, who was a gifted seer herself and believed the subject deserved formal instruction. The debate about whether divination belonged in a serious academic curriculum began the day the class was first offered and had not been resolved by the time Sybil Trelawney was teaching it in the 1990s. Care of magical creatures was formalized as a subject in the mid-13th century, replacing an earlier, more informal arrangement where students who wanted to learn about magical beasts were sent to talk to whoever happened to be working in the grounds at the time. This was fine when the groundskeeper was a patient and knowledgeable wizard. It was less fine in 1267, when the groundskeeper was a man named Alberic, who kept 9 blast-ended scroots in the vegetable garden. and was surprised every single time one of them exploded. Muggle studies was added to the curriculum sometime in the 14th century, which says something interesting about the wizarding world's relationship to its own history. By 1300, the International Statute of Secrecy was still 400 years away, but the separation of magical and non-magical communities was already proceeding fast enough that wizarding children were growing up with less and less contact with Muggle life. Muggle studies gave those children a formal channel for understanding a world that, depending on their background, they might have almost no direct knowledge of. Part 6. The Sorting Hat's warnings recurring. 993 AD to the present, every September since the first term, the Sorting Hat has opened the year with a song. This is unusual in magical practice, a single enchanted object operating continuously for 1,000 years, composing new music and new verse every year without human intervention. The hat draws on the personalities and values of the 4 founders embedded within it, on everything it has learned from the thousands of heads it has sat on, and on whatever it observes about the state of the wizarding world in any given year. Most years the songs are relatively light, introductions to the 4 houses, exhortations to work hard, reminders that knowledge is valuable and bravery is earned. Students in the middle of their schooling often stop listening carefully. By 5th year, many of them have stopped listening at all. But the hat occasionally breaks from this pattern to deliver something more pointed. In 1991, Harry Potter's first year, the hat gave one of its standard songs. In 1994, it gave another. But in 1995, with the Dark Lord newly returned and the Ministry in denial, the hat did something it had not done in decades. It departed from celebration and gave a warning. It told the school in verse that a long time ago, the founders had been divided, and that division had created a weakness. It said the houses needed to unite or face what was coming from a position of internal fracture. It said it specifically and clearly, and most of the students stopped paying attention around the 3rd verse. Dumbledore heard it and said nothing publicly, though he likely had thoughts. Dolores Umbridge, newly installed as a ministry presence at the school, found the song inappropriate and said so in a memo. The hat tried again the following year. It was right both times, in the way old things that have been watching for a long time tend to be right. The houses never fully united in the way the hat wanted. They united partially when it mattered most. In May 1998, on the grounds of a castle that was partly in rubble, and that was enough. But the hat's underlying point, that Slytherin's departure had left a fracture that 1,000 years of house rivalry had made structural, was an observation that outlasted the battle and never really got resolved. Part 7. The Medieval Headmasters 1100–1500 AD. The headmasters and headmistresses of Hogwarts in its first 5 centuries are imperfectly documented, and several of them are known to history, primarily because of specific disasters associated with their tenure. Eupraxia Mole, who served as headmistress in the early 12th century, is remembered for the incident in which the defense against the dark arts classroom was occupied for 3 months by a colony of pixies who had somehow learned to defend their territory using the students' own wands, which they had stolen. The exact mechanism by which this occurred was never established. Mole resolved it by sealing the classroom and teaching defense classes in the corridor until the pixies ate through the door. Prendergast the Precise, headmaster in the mid-13th century, left behind more documentation than almost any other medieval headmaster, which is how we know his nickname was ironic. Prendergast made 17 documented attempts to establish a comprehensive record-keeping system for the school and abandoned 16 of them within a year. The 17th attempt, which involved magically enchanted quills that wrote down everything that happened automatically, was abandoned. After, the quills began recording the headmaster's private conversations and could not be stopped from reading the transcripts aloud at dinner. Dilys Derwent became headmistress in 1741 and served for 31 years, which makes her one of the longest-serving heads in the school's first 8 centuries. She was also a healer of considerable reputation, and her portrait at Hogwarts maintained a second portrait at St. Mungo's Hospital, allowing her to shuttle between locations even after death. The portraits of past headmasters and headmistresses at Hogwarts were of custom established early in the school's history, a way of preserving the judgment and memory of former heads for consultation by their successors. The portraits could not act independently of the living head's wishes, Anne, but they could offer counsel, disagree loudly, and occasionally side with students against the current administration, which several of them did on at least one recorded occasion each. Armando Dippet served as headmaster from sometime in the 1910s through approximately 1956. His tenure covered the Second World War and the period during which Tom Riddle was a student, a combination of historical circumstances that shaped everything that followed. Dippet was a capable administrator and a careful headmaster, but he was old and tired by the time Riddle arrived, and he trusted Riddle in ways that would matter. Albus Dumbledore was Transfiguration Professor during Dippet's tenure, before becoming headmaster himself. He watched Tom Riddle's time at Hogwarts with more clarity than Dippet did, and was correspondingly more cautious about the boy. This caution was well-founded but insufficient. The chamber opened under Dippet's headmastership in 1943, and a girl nearly died, and a student was expelled for it, the wrong student. The actual perpetrator became head boy the following year. Part 8. The Chamber Opens Hogwarts, 1942. 1943. Tom Riddle was 12 years old when he found the Chamber of Secrets. He had been looking for it since he arrived at Hogwarts at 11, because he had grown up knowing he was a Parseltongue and had read enough to understand what that meant about his ancestry. The connection to Slytherin was something Riddle had understood before he could fully explain it, and finding the chamber was less a discovery than a confirmation of something he had already suspected about himself. The chamber was exactly where Slytherin had left it, 1,000 years before. Deep beneath the school, accessible through the second-floor girls' bathroom, through a pipe that opened to a Parseltongue command. The basilisk was still alive. Anne. Basilisks can live for centuries, and this one had been living in the chamber in the dark, with no company, since approximately 1010 AD, 930 years alone in a chamber under a loch. The creature was not mad exactly. Madness requires the disruption of a baseline state, and the basilisk had had no state to disrupt. It had simply waited in the way old and enormous things wait, with the patience of something that does not experience time the way smaller creatures do. Riddle opened the chamber and spoke to the basilisk and understood what he had. He set it loose. Over the course of the 1942-1943 academic year, the basilisk moved through the pipes of the school and attacked students. Several were petrified, catching the creature's gaze indirectly in reflections or through camera lenses or through other students' eyeglasses. None died. This was not by Riddle's mercy. The deaths he wanted were deaths of blood traitors and muggleborns, and the specific deaths he wanted required more care than he was in a position to exercise. With a weapon he could not precisely aim. The near fatality was Moaning Myrtle, who died meeting the basilisk's direct gaze in the girls' bathroom, and spent the next 50 years haunting its plumbing. She was the only casualty that year, though she was not the one Riddle intended. When the attacks threatened to close the school, Riddle did what he calculated would serve him best. He framed Hagrid, a gentle half-giant in his third year, who had been keeping an acromantula named Aragog in a cupboard, which was genuinely against school rules, even if it was not even slightly related to the actual attacks. The evidence Riddle manufactured was circumstantial but sufficient for Dippet's purposes. Hagrid was expelled. His wand was snapped. His opportunity to learn magic was ended at 13 years old, because he was convenient, and because Riddle understood that framing someone is easier when they've already done something wrong. Dumbledore argued against the expulsion. He lost. He watched Riddle become head boy. He watched him graduate. He never forgot any of it. Part 9. The Ghosts of Hogwarts' Permanent Residents. Various centuries, every castle accumulates things that refuse to leave. Hogwarts accumulated 5. The Hogwarts ghosts are not tragic exactly, though all of them made decisions at the moment of their deaths that they have had centuries to reconsider. Becoming a ghost in the wizarding world is a choice, or at least a failure to make a different one. You linger because you fear what comes next, or because you left something unfinished. or because you simply could not bear to stop existing even when existence requires haunting a corridor instead of living in a body, none of them would tell you they regret it. Some of them almost certainly do. Nearly headless Nick, Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington, died on October 31, 1492, in a botched beheading that required 45 axe blows and still failed to sever his head completely. Anne. He is 1.5 inches of neck from being technically headless, a distinction that has prevented him from joining the headless hunt for 500 years. He attends the hunt's meetings as an observer. He is not invited to participate. He goes anyway and sits in the corner and watches them play headless golf with dignity that has been practiced so long it has become real. Nick was a courtier in his life, which prepared him well for 5 centuries of Hogwarts social navigation. He is loyal to Gryffindor House, with a consistency that outlasted everyone he was originally loyal to, and he takes his role as House Ghost with seriousness that the students rarely match. He was the one Harry Potter found in the corridor after his first feast, offering guidance on where to find the Gryffindor common room, which Nick would have located even if he could not physically enter it. He threw himself a 500th Death Day party in 1992 and invited Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who came out of politeness and spent an evening listening to a string quartet playing music that had been composed to be as cacophonous as possible. Ghost parties are not the same as living parties. The food was rotting, deliberately, so the ghosts could smell it and feel something approximating the sensation of eating. The 3 Gryffindors ate nothing and stayed for an hour and counted it as kindness well spent. The Bloody Baron haunts the Slytherin dungeons and has for 1,000 years. He is covered in silver bloodstains that no one, in 10 centuries, has asked him about directly. The Fat Friar, who haunts the Hufflepuff dungeons, is warm and cheerful, and has been trying for 500 years to get the Hogwarts ghosts to organize properly, with rules and procedures and regular meetings. None of the other ghosts have shown interest. The Grey Lady haunts the Ravenclaw areas of the castle, and does not speak to people very much, which people assume is a Ravenclaw quality but is in fact grief. She is Helena Ravenclaw, Rowena's daughter. She stole her mother's diadem in life, hid it in Albania, refused to say where, when a young man she once loved came to get it from her, and died in the forest where he killed her when she refused. The young man killed himself shortly after. He became the Bloody Baron. They have shared a castle for 1,000 years and do not speak of it. Peeves is not a ghost. He is a poltergeist, which means he is not the spirit of a dead person, but rather a concentration of chaos that has taken up residence in Hogwarts and cannot be removed. He has never had a body, a name, a birthday, or a perspective that could be reasonably called his own. He has only energy, and the specific form that energy takes in Peeves is the urgent desire to make noise, break things, humiliate students, and infuriate Filch, approximately in that order of priority. Every headmaster from the founding to the present day has tried to remove Peeves. None has succeeded. He acknowledged the authority of the Bloody Baron, apparently out of some reciprocal understanding of very old things, and he followed the directions of Fred and George Weasley during their spectacular departure from the school in 1996 because he respected what they had done. These are the only entities on record to whom Peeves showed consistent deference. When the Battle of Hogwarts was fought, Peeves dropped Snargaluff pods from the upper floors onto Death Eaters in the entrance hall. He sang a victory song afterward that was offensive, inaccurate in its details, and genuinely funny. No one who was there has ever admitted publicly that they laughed, but several have. Moaning Myrtle died in 1943 in the second-floor girls' bathroom, as previously noted, and has haunted it ever since. She is the youngest of the Hogwarts ghosts, the most recently dead, and the most consistently miserable. The misery is partly circumstance. Dying at 14 in a bathroom is not a story that lends itself to dignity, and partly personality. Myrtle had a hard time alive, and death did not improve her perspective. She floods the bathroom when upset, which is often Anne. She watches whatever goes on in the pipes with an attention that nobody asked for. When Harry opened the pipe to the Chamber of Secrets, she watched and offered directions and felt some mild satisfaction at being useful. She never left the bathroom. Some students were kind to her and most weren't. 50 years is a long time to haunt a room you never wanted to die in. Part 10. The Room of Requirement, Hogwarts Castle. Exact date of creation unknown. No one knows exactly when the Room of Requirement was created, or who created it, or how. It is one of the castle's genuine mysteries. The room appears on the 7th floor corridor, on the left side, across from a tapestry showing Barnabas the Barmy attempting to teach ballet to trolls. To access it, a person must walk past the blank wall 3 times, while concentrating on what they need. Specifically what they need, not what they want. The room does not appear for desires. It appears for necessity. A caretaker who needed to hide cleaning supplies found it full of mops and buckets. Dumbledore, who needed to use the bathroom urgently during a feast, found it containing an appropriate facility. A student who needed somewhere to cry and be alone found it as a small, quiet room, with a comfortable chair and a window showing a garden that does not exist anywhere in Scotland. The room had been used for many things by the time Harry Potter arrived at Hogwarts. Centuries of students had found it in moments of genuine need and never entirely understood what they had encountered. It was first confirmed to exist in published wizarding history when Dumbledore mentioned it to the Minister for Magic, adding that he had accidentally discovered it while looking for a bathroom on the 5th floor. A geographical inconsistency the Minister did not question because it was Dumbledore. The room had a second form that most people did not know about. The Room of Hidden Things. Everything that had ever been concealed in the Room of Requirement remained there, accumulated over centuries, in a vast chaotic space filled with broken furniture and old textbooks and unwanted heirlooms, and a number of objects that their owners had very urgently wished to forget about. Rowena Ravenclaw's diadem was hidden there for centuries before Tom Riddle found it and turned it into a Horcrux. It sat among the rubble and the cast-offs of 1,000 years of Hogwarts students inside an enchanted tiara that amplified wisdom in its wearer, and nobody found it for 7 centuries because nobody was looking. Dumbledore's army used the room as their primary training space during the 1995-199-6 academic year. 28 students learned to cast Patronuses in there, and shield charms and disarming spells and stunning spells, and the specific kind of determination that comes from choosing to fight when the official position is that there is nothing to fight. The room gave them what they needed: space, practice dummies, a bookshelf that updated itself with relevant texts, cushions for when people fell, and an entrance that would not appear for Dolores Umbridge, no matter how many times she walked past. The room understood what its occupants needed. Anne. During the Battle of Hogwarts, Neville Longbottom used it to shelter and feed the students who refused to leave the school after the Carrows. Occupation made the corridors dangerous. The room provided food and sleeping arrangements, and a secure entrance from the Hog's Head pub through a tunnel that had been created because someone needed it badly enough. It was, in its way, the most humane architectural feature in the castle, and it had been there the whole time. Crabbe set it on fire in May 1998, trying to kill Harry Potter, and a substantial portion of the centuries of accumulated hidden objects burned. The room survived. It always had. Part 11. The Defense Against the Dark Arts Problem 1940s. 1997, Tom Riddle applied for the Defense Against the Dark Arts position twice. The first time was after he graduated from Hogwarts in 1945, when he came back to ask Dippet for the job. Dippet turned him down, saying he was too young and should go out and gather experience first. Riddle left and went to work at Borgin & Burke's, an antique shop in Knockturn Alley that specialized in cursed objects, which is precisely what a person with Riddle's interests and contacts would do. He came back 10 years later to ask again. The school was Dumbledore's by then, and the man who came through the door was not quite what Dumbledore remembered from 1945. Something had happened to Riddle in the intervening decade that was visible in his face, in his eyes, in the quality of his presence. He had made Horcruxes, he had split his soul. He was beginning from the outside to look like what he was becoming on the inside. Dumbledore said no. Whether the curse on the position dates from that second refusal from the first, or from Slytherin's departure centuries earlier, is disputed. What is not disputed is that from approximately this period onward, no defense against the dark arts professor lasted more than a year. Anne. The teaching staff of Hogwarts in the latter half of the 20th century included, in this position, a man who spent his year trying to prove a dangerous creature didn't exist and spent the following year in a hospital, a fraud who taught students to defend against curses he had personally performed on their families, a werewolf who resigned when his condition was exposed, a Death Eater impersonating a retired Auror, Dolores Umbridge, who refused to teach the subject's practical content entirely, Severus Snape, who taught it competently for 1 year before the circumstances of that year made his continuation impossible, and Amicus Carrow, who replaced the defense's content with instruction in performing dark curses on other students. Quirinus Quirrell taught it the year Harry arrived. He had Voldemort's face growing from the back of his head, which he concealed under a purple turban, and he managed to maintain this situation through an entire school year of professional contact with Albus Dumbledore, which says more about how people see what they expect to see than it does about Quirrell's concealment skills. Gilderoy Lockhart taught it in Harry's second year. He was a fraud. His entire professional history, 7 books, 1,000 photographs, a ministry recognition, was constructed from interviews with actual wizards about the extraordinary things they had done, followed by the removal of those wizards' memories and the publication of their stories under his name. He was extraordinarily handsome, and he knew it, and he used it. He came apart under pressure, which was not surprising, and his own memory charm backfired on him during the incident in the Chamber of Secrets, leaving him cheerful and amnesiac in St. Mungo's for the rest of his life. The curse broke in 1997 when Voldemort died in May 1998. Having spent the intervening year in control of the school directly, it had done its work for 50 years. Part 12. The Marauders Hogwarts, 1971-1978. 4 students arrived at Hogwarts in September 1971 who would, over the course of 7 years, leave a mark on the school that lasted for decades. James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, Peter Pettigrew. They were sorted into Gryffindor, all 4, and they became friends with the speed that 11-year-olds manage when they recognize something essential in each other. By second year, they were inseparable. By third year, they had started calling themselves the Marauders, which was the kind of name that seemed excellent at 13, and which all of them, had they reached middle age, would have found somewhat embarrassing. Remus Lupin was a werewolf. This fact arrived at Hogwarts with him, invisible, and remained invisible for most of his time there. He had been bitten as a young child, an act of deliberate spite by the werewolf Fenrir Greyback against his father. The Ministry's standard position on werewolves was that they were dangerous, and that their presence in normal wizarding society was at best a managed risk and at worst unacceptable. Dumbledore's position was that Remus Lupin was a child who deserved an education, and that the practical problem of his monthly transformations could be managed with appropriate preparation. The preparation was the Whomping Willow. Planted in 1971, the Whomping Willow sat in the school grounds and attacked anyone who came near it. This was understood by most of the school as simply another Hogwarts peculiarity, of which there were many. The actual purpose of the tree was to protect a tunnel under its roots that led to the Shrieking Shack on the outskirts of Hogsmeade, where Lupin transformed each full moon, safe from harming anyone. The shack's reputation for haunting was a rumor Dumbledore encouraged to keep students away. What nobody planned for was the other 3 boys. James, Sirius, and Peter worked out in their 3rd year that Remus was a werewolf. They had 4 years of school left, and they sat with what they had worked out and decided, independently and then together, that the correct response was not fear or distance or disclosure, but friendship, taken further than friendship had been taken before. They would become animagi. They would learn to transform, without formal training, into animals, a process that usually takes years of supervised study, so that they could accompany Remus during his transformations. A werewolf in the company of animals was calmer and safer than one alone. It took them 3 years. By 5th year, James could become a stag, Sirius a large black dog, Peter a rat. They spent the full moons with Lupin in the shack, and sometimes in the grounds of Hogsmeade. The animagus transformation was illegal without ministry registration. They didn't register. They called themselves, in their private shorthand, Moony, Wormtail, Padfoot and Prongs, which was the kind of naming system that also seemed excellent at 15 and would have seemed embarrassing later. They also built the Marauders map. The map was a feat of magical cartography that should have been beyond fifth year students. It showed every room of Hogwarts in real time, labelled with the name and location of every person in the castle, the enchantments required to make it work, the tracking spell, the cartographic charm, the magical signature identification, the updating mechanism, were separately complex and had never been combined before. They did it anyway. The map insulted anyone who tried to misuse it, which they had also enchanted deliberately. When Severus Snape found it, during the Marauders' time at school, the map called him a git and declined to explain its function, which Snape noted and remembered for 30 years. The map was confiscated by Argus Filch, who kept it in his office, labelled confiscated and highly dangerous. Fred and George Weasley stole it in their first year by picking the lock on the relevant cabinet. They used it for 6 years, never fully understanding what they had. Harry Potter used it to see his dead father's name moving through the corridors of Hogwarts, not knowing yet that the small dot labelled James Potter was his father's footprint preserved in the enchantment, moving through the school he had built into. Still there, in the only way that things can be, after the people who made them are gone. Running word count, approximately 8,050 words of narrative script content, excluding headings and stage notes. The Complete History of Hogwarts Part 2, of 5 approx. 8,000 words Part 13. Dumbledore's Long Road to Headmaster, 1892, 1956. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore was born in the summer of 1881 in the village of Moldonth Wold, which is exactly the kind of place name that only exists in the English West Country, and that nobody from there finds even slightly amusing. His father was a wizard named Percival Dumbledore, who died in Azkaban. His mother was a witch named Kendra, who moved the family to Godric's Hollow after the incident that put Percival there. His younger brother was Aberforth, who smelled of goats and had a lifelong talent for charms he never fully acknowledged. His younger sister was Ariana, and Ariana is the place where the Dumbledore family story becomes one that Albus spent the rest of his very long life trying to make sense of. Ariana was 6 years old when 3 Muggle boys saw her practicing magic in the garden and reacted with the particular fear that some people have when they see something they don't understand and can't control. They hurt her. The details of what they did are not fully recorded, and Ariana never spoke of it after, but whatever it was, broke something in her ability to manage her own magic. She could not control it. She could not release it safely. She kept it locked inside her, and it came out sideways, in bursts, in ways that sometimes hurt the people around her and sometimes hurt herself. Percival Dumbledore found out what the boys had done and attacked them. He was caught, tried, and sent to Azkaban, where he died some years later. He never told anyone his reasons, apparently to protect Ariana from being taken by the Ministry and locked up in St. Mungo's. He died in prison with people thinking him simply violent. Kendra moved the family to Godric's Hollow and kept Ariana hidden, and Albus was brilliant at Hogwarts. Head boy, top of every subject, winner of every prize, and came home after his 7th year expecting the freedom that achievement earns, and found instead that his mother needed help managing the family, and his sister needed watching, and his plans for a grand tour of Europe with his friend Doge would have to wait. He waited for about 3 weeks before Gellert Grindelwald arrived next door. Grindelwald was also brilliant, 17 years old, and staying with his Greetaunt Bathilda Bagshot in Godric's Hollow for the summer. Anne. He had just been expelled from Durmstrang for experiments considered too dangerous even by that school's standards. Anne. He was beautiful in the way that certain people are. The kind of beautiful that makes other people feel chosen for being noticed by them. Albus noticed him and was noticed back. And for about 2 months they were inseparable in the way that only very young people who have found someone who matches their intelligence can be. They talked about power and magic and the future and a world where wizards did not have to hide. Anne. They wrote about it in letters full of the particular grandiosity of exceptionally gifted teenagers. They talked about the Deathly Hallows, Anne. They talked about for the greater good, which was Grindelwald's phrase, and which Dumbledore adopted with the ease of someone borrowing an argument that fit what he already half believed. Aberforth interrupted the friendship the way younger siblings interrupt things, badly and necessarily. He confronted Albus about Ariana, about the plans they were making that had no room in them for a sister who couldn't be taken along and couldn't be left behind. There was an argument. Grindelwald used the Cruciatus Curse on Aberforth. Albus and Grindelwald duelled, and in the middle of all of it, Ariana's uncontrolled magic discharged and she died. Nobody ever established which of the three of them fired the curse that killed her. Grindelwald left. Dumbledore buried his mother and his sister and spent the rest of his life with that unanswered question. He was 18 years old. He would live to be 115. He carried it the whole way. He went to Hogwarts to teach. Transfiguration first, then other subjects. He built a reputation that became, over decades, the standard against which other reputations were measured. He defeated Grindelwald himself in 1945 in a duel that lasted for hours and was witnessed by people who spent the rest of their lives struggling to describe it. He declined the post of Minister for Magic multiple times to multiple ministers because he was honest enough with himself to know that wanting power was exactly the reason he should not have it. He became headmaster of Hogwarts in 1956 and held the position for 41 years. His office was circular, filled with silver instruments that moved on their own. Portraits of past headmasters who watched everything and commented on some of it, and a pensieve that he used to store the memories he could not afford to keep where they would distract him. A phoenix named Fawkes lived there, burning and renewing every few years on a stand near the window. The office smelled of old books and lemon drops. The password to enter it changed regularly and was always some kind of sweet. Sherbet lemon, cockroach cluster, acid pop, in a tradition that every student eventually figured out and no one was supposed to know. He ran the school the way he ran everything, with warmth on the surface, strategy underneath, and more information than he showed. He trusted people with exactly as much as they needed, and no more, which was the right call in many situations, and a catastrophic one in a few. Part 14. Tom Riddle at Hogwarts, 1938-1945. He arrived as an orphan from a London orphanage in the summer of 1938, when Dumbledore came to tell him what he was. The room in the orphanage was small and deliberately bare, the kind of bare that a child creates who has learned that anything worth having gets taken. Tom Riddle had already been controlling smaller children for years. Anne had already been doing things he couldn't entirely explain, had already understood in some essential way that he was different from the people around him, and that this difference was the most important thing about him. Dumbledore sat in the one chair and Tom Riddle sat on the bed, and Dumbledore told him he was a wizard. He asked for honesty and got what looked like honesty, and was in fact something more careful. He noted things, the way Riddle already knew what he could do, the pleasure he took in explaining it, the collection of objects stolen from other children that confirmed certain inferences. He made a mental note and filed it and said nothing. Hogwarts changed Riddle immediately and entirely, in the way that some people bloom into the right environment with a speed that other people find unnerving. He was sorted into Slytherin. He was clever enough to lead without appearing to, which is the more difficult skill. Anne. He collected followers the way other students collected chocolate frog cards, systematically, with an eye toward what each person could provide. He was charming to teachers and careful about it, so that the charm read as genuine rather than calculated. Most of the time, he found the chamber in his second year and confirmed his suspicions about himself. He found the Horcrux records in the library's restricted section and confirmed other suspicions. He told Slughorn, then the potions teacher, about Horcruxes in a casual conversation that he arranged to seem like academic curiosity, and Slughorn told him more than he should have, and Riddle stored that information with the rest and moved toward what it enabled. He was head boy in his 7th year, 1944-1945. He was charming in the prefect's meetings. He was respected by the staff who could be respected and was excellent to the faces of the others. He graduated to excellent reviews and departed for Borgin and Berks, and within a few years he had changed his name to something constructed from an anagram of the name he'd been given at birth, erasing the orphan's Muggle surname and the grandfather's legacy along with it, and he disappeared from the wizarding world's awareness for roughly a decade. What happened in those years, the wanderings, the murders, the Horcruxes, belongs to a different story. What belongs to Hogwarts is what he left behind in the school and what he came back for. He left the Horcrux in the room of hidden things. Ravenclaw's diadem, which he had found in Albania, which he had touched and turned into a container for a piece of his divided soul. He concealed it in the room that contained everything Hogwarts students had ever wanted to forget. He may have thought this was clever. It was, for a while. He came back in 1956 to ask Dumbledore for the Defense Against the Dark Arts job, and Dumbledore looked at him across the headmaster's desk and said no, quietly and without elaboration, and watched the man leave. The position remained cursed. Teachers came and went. The school continued, because schools continue regardless of what dark things have been done in their walls, and that continuity is not indifference, but a different kind of defiance. Part 15. The First Wizarding War Comes to Hogwarts, 1970. 1981 Voldemort's first rise happened mostly outside the school's walls, in the ministry, and in private homes, and on roads at night, and in the kind of darkness that doesn't photograph well or leave clear records. But it arrived at Hogwarts gradually, the way most things arrive, as a change in atmosphere before it became a change in fact. Students who attended Hogwarts in the early 1970s remember the shift. The school felt different from one year to the next. Students stopped talking openly about their families. Muggle-born students learned, without anyone telling them explicitly, to be careful about what they said and to whom. Children of Death Eaters arrived in September, with a particular quality of confidence that had been calibrated over summer dinners in households, where the coming war was not a horror but an anticipation. The school was supposed to be safe. By the mid-1970s it was still safer than the outside world, but the distinction was narrowing. Dumbledore navigated this with the specific difficulty of a man running an institution that must remain open to all children when some of those children's parents are trying to destroy the world those children are being educated to live in. He could not expel students for their parents' beliefs. He could not interrogate arrivals. He could not run a school on suspicion. He kept it open, kept teaching, kept the lights on in the Great Hall, while the darkness pressed from outside, and trusted that what the school gave students, knowledge, friendship, the experience of being somewhere that cared what happened to them, would matter. For some of them it did. For others it was too late before they arrived. Severus Snape was sorted into Slytherin in 1971, the same year as the Marauders. He was thin and poor and from a Muggle neighborhood, and the combination of his background and his intelligence made him someone who understood early that being underestimated was both a wound and a resource. He was fascinated by the dark arts before he understood what they led to, in the way that certain people are drawn to the most powerful version of anything regardless of its cost. He made friends in Slytherin who would become Death Eaters because those were the friends available to him in Slytherin in 1971, and he made an enemy of James Potter, who had the ease that comes from being loved and comfortable and talented simultaneously, and Snape hated that ease with the specific hatred of someone who has earned everything by effort and watched certain people receive by default what he could never quite reach. He called Lily Evans a mudblood when she tried to defend him. She had been his friend since childhood. The Muggle-born girl from his street in Cokeworth, the first person to tell him what he was, the first person to see him before he understood what he was worth. He had loved her in the way that people love the people who see them before anyone else does. He said it in a moment of humiliated fury in front of half the school, and she walked away and did not come back, and he spent the rest of his life with that. He joined the Death Eaters after school because he was already half in before he graduated, and he carried information to Voldemort about a prophecy he overheard, not understanding until it was too late that the prophecy pointed at Lily's son. He went to Dumbledore when he understood. Dumbledore protected the Potters, and they died anyway, and Snape agreed to spend the rest of his life doing whatever Dumbledore asked. And Dumbledore asked him to come back to Hogwarts and teach potions, which Snape did, beginning in 1981. He was a difficult teacher. This is an understatement. He was difficult in the specific way of someone who learned everything by being brilliant and alone, and who has therefore no patience for students who learn slowly, and no mechanism for distinguishing between genuine confusion and laziness. And he was cruel to Harry Potter in ways that were partly deliberate strategy and partly something that he could not prevent even when he tried, because looking at Harry's face was looking at James Potter, and James Potter was the first place where the story of Snape's life went wrong. And he was also the only reason Dumbledore had any intelligence on Voldemort's activities for the 20 years between the end of the First Wizarding War and the beginning of the Second. This is a fact that Hogwarts students did not know, could not know, and that would have changed nearly every opinion they ever held about their potions teacher. Part 16. The Castle in Peacetime, 1981-1991. For 10 years after the Potters died and Voldemort was gone, and the wizarding world celebrated in a way that Dumbledore found premature, Hogwarts was just a school again. The 1980s at Hogwarts were a particular decade. Voldemort was gone. The war was over, or everyone wanted it to be over. Students arrived in September, without the atmosphere of fear that had defined the previous decade. The curriculum normalized. The defense against the dark arts teachers continued to cycle through with regularity, but the subject's urgency felt theoretical rather than practical. Students learned counterjinxes and studied theoretical dark creatures and handed in essays and took exams and graduated into a world that was recovering. The physical school in this decade was in reasonable condition, and there had been some damage during the war years, not structural, but the kind of wear that accumulates in a building that has absorbed a lot of fear. The staircases moved as they always had. The Great Hall's ceiling showed the Scottish weather with uninterrupted accuracy. The greenhouses produced what they always produced. Peeves broke things, and Filch repaired them, and Snape swept through the corridors, and nearly Headless Nick attended his Death Day preparations with the same annual melancholy. The students of this era were less defined by what they had survived than the students before them, which meant they were more free to be defined by other things. Quidditch rivalries, romantic dramas, exam stress, the specific social architecture of 500 children living together in a medieval castle for 9 months a year. The houses competed with the intensity that only institutions generate. The points system, which awarded and deducted from house totals throughout the year for academic achievement and disciplinary infractions, occupied a disproportionate amount of student attention. Students who lost points for their house faced social consequences from their peers that the teachers neither entirely intended nor entirely discouraged, because the competition was useful for keeping the energy of several hundred young people channeled towards something relatively harmless. The Quidditch teams of the 1980s were exceptional, producing players who went on to professional careers and one who went on to be Minister for Magic, though the latter fact is more a reflection of Quidditch's social function than its athletic one. Dumbledore in this decade was still the most famous wizard in Britain and still, to all appearances, exactly what the school needed: old, calm, omniscient, in the way that very experienced teachers appear omniscient, full of the particular wisdom that comes from having seen enough generations of students to know that most of what looks like catastrophe at 15 looks like growing up at 30. He was also, though nobody could see this, preparing. He knew Voldemort was not gone. He had always known. He had spent 10 years looking and finding traces and building his understanding of what had survived, and by the late 1980s, he had a reasonable picture of what was coming back, and roughly when, and he was making decisions about how to meet it. Some of those decisions were things he could justify. Some of them, he knew, were things he would have to live with knowing he could not. Part 17. The Year Harry arrived September 1991. The first years crossed the lake on the 1st of September, 1991, in boats that moved on their own, with lanterns at the prow. They came from a fleet of carriages that had pulled up at Hogsmeade Station in the dark, and a giant named Hagrid had herded them toward the shore with the cheerful authority of someone who had done this many times and found the nervousness of 11-year-olds charming rather than exhausting. Harry Potter sat in one of those boats with Ron Weasley, whom he had met on the train, and who had told him about the houses and the sorting, with the confident inaccuracy of someone who had heard the story many times from older siblings and assumed they understood it. They looked up at the castle as it came into view over the tree line, lit windows, towers, the reflection of the whole thing wavering in the loch below, and Harry, who had spent his first 10 years sleeping in a cupboard under a staircase at number 4 Privet Drive, felt for the first time in his life that he was going somewhere rather than leaving. The year of Harry Potter's arrival at Hogwarts was a particular year. The Philosopher's Stone was in the school, moved there from Gringotts at Dumbledore's request. The protection around it had been designed collaboratively by the school's staff. Fluffy, the three-headed dog, courtesy of Hagrid, Devil's Snare from Professor Sprout, a flying key sequence in an enchanted chamber from Professor Flitwick, a life-size wizard chess set from Professor McGonagall, a troll from Professor Quirrell, who had positioned himself to appear cooperative while being the only member of staff who knew exactly what was being protected and why, a potion logic puzzle from Snape. The protections worked well enough to stop most people. They did not stop an 11-year-old who had a particular kind of motivation and 2 unusually talented friends. Quirrell died in the underground chamber when Harry touched him, skin to skin, and the protection Lily's sacrifice had left in Harry's blood acted on contact. Dumbledore found Harry unconscious and woke him in the hospital wing and told him things that were both true and carefully incomplete, which was a pattern Dumbledore would maintain for 6 more years. The stone was destroyed. Voldemort had not touched it. The year ended, students went home, and Gryffindor won the House Cup by a margin that rested on points awarded in the final hours to 4 students who had broken most of the school's rules and saved the world by accident on a Tuesday. Dumbledore gave the last-minute points with the cheerful openness of a man who has earned the right to do exactly what he wants. Part 18. The years. The castle tested itself 1991, 1995. Each of Harry Potter's years at Hogwarts broke something in the school's idea of its own safety. The chamber opened again in his 2nd year. 50 years after Riddle had first opened it, the diary Horcrux he had left behind had found its way into the hands of a 12-year-old girl named Ginny Weasley, who had been writing in it all summer with the trusting urgency of someone who needed a friend and had found one and didn't understand what kind of friend a piece of Voldemort's soul would be. Ginny had been using the diary the way people use journals, confessing things, asking things, receiving in return the kind of understanding that is hard to distinguish from genuine empathy when you are 12 and lonely. The diary controlled her. She didn't know it was doing it. She scratched messages on the walls in blood and then had no memory of doing it. She opened the chamber and set the basilisk on students who the diary had identified, Muggleborns, Anne, and those connected to them, and she hid what she couldn't remember and grew more frightened with every week. 5 students and 1 cat and 1 ghost were petrified before the chamber was found. The school was nearly closed. The staff, Dumbledore suspended, McGonagall, acting head, wrote letters home, explaining the situation with the careful language of institutions that are required to inform without causing panic and frequently achieve neither goal. Parents pulled students out. The corridors felt emptier. The remaining students moved in groups and checked every mirror twice. Harry and Ron went into the chamber through the pipes in the 2nd floor bathroom, and Harry killed the basilisk with the sword of Gryffindor, which had appeared in the sorting hat when he reached into it, because he asked for help and genuinely needed it, and the hat gave what was required. He destroyed the diary with a basilisk fang. The piece of soul inside it was obliterated. Ginny lived. Harry nearly did not. Dumbledore was brought back by the school governors after the chamber closed. Lucius Malfoy, who had slipped Ginny the diary in Flourish and blots in Diagon Alley at the summer, orchestrated the governor's complaint that had gotten Dumbledore suspended and lost the vote when the crisis resolved. Harry's 3rd year brought a different kind of darkness to the school. Dementors were stationed at the entrances to Hogwarts, placed there by the Ministry over Dumbledore's objections, ostensibly to protect the school from an escaped convict named Sirius Black. Dementors, stationed at a school full of children, was not an arrangement that a person with functioning priorities would have chosen. The Ministry chose it. The Dementors walked the perimeter, and the sky over Hogwarts turned grey in September and stayed grey, and students who passed too close to them heard the worst things they could remember, rendered in high definition, pulled out of their minds and played at full volume in the cold air. Harry collapsed the first time he encountered one on the Hogwarts Express, which stopped in the middle of nowhere and went dark and cold, and Remus Lupin, newly hired as Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, keeping his condition carefully unannounced, conjured the only thing that makes Dementors retreat, a Patronus charm. A silver wolf streaked down the aisle. The Dementor left. Lupin gave Harry chocolate and the world slowly came back. He taught Harry to produce a Patronus that year. This was not on the standard curriculum. He taught Harry because Harry asked, and because Lupin had spent enough of his life knowing that the thing he needed wasn't always the thing on offer, and that sometimes a teacher simply does the actual job. The silver stag that Harry eventually produced was his father, though he didn't know that when he first made it. Sirius Black turned out to be innocent, and the real traitor was Peter Pettigrew, who had spent 12 years as a rat in Ron Weasley's pocket, and Pettigrew escaped, and Sirius was recaptured without trial, and the Ministry prepared to administer the Dementor's kiss, and Dumbledore sent Hermione and Harry back through time with a small device that saved Sirius and a hippogriff named Buckbeak, and changed nothing official about the Ministry's version of events. The school felt the weight of all of it without comment, the way old buildings absorb what happens in them. If this is where sleep finds you, that's where it's supposed to. The castle is still there. The lights are still on in the towers. You can hear the lake if you listen. Leave the rest of the story for later. It will be here when you come back. If you want to keep going, if you're not ready yet, that's all right too. There's more to tell. There's always more to tell about Hogwarts. And if you enjoyed getting this far and want the complete story, every era, every war, every secret room and cursed professor and impossible year, subscribe and hit the bell. Every video on this channel is exactly this, a long story told slowly, somewhere to put your mind while your body rests. Stay comfortable. Keep breathing. We're staying in the castle tonight. Part 19. The Triwizard Tournament Hogwarts, 1994-1995. The Triwizard Tournament returned to Hogwarts in Harry's 4th year after a 200-year suspension following a death toll that had made it impossible to defend as educational. Anne. The tournament had been created in the 13th century as a competition between the 3 largest wizarding schools of Europe. Hogwarts, Bogues-Bayton's Academy of Magic in the south of France, and Durmstrang Institute, whose location was kept deliberately secret, but was understood to be somewhere in the far north of Europe. 3 champions, 1 from each school, competed in 3 tasks of increasing difficulty, and the winner received 1,000 galleons and permanent glory, which turned out to be a combination of incentives strong enough to produce the kind of preparation that occasionally got people killed. The Ministry agreed to allow the tournament's return with some concessions. An age limit, no student under 17 could enter. A magical contract enforced by the Goblet of Fire, which selected champions and bound them to compete regardless of what they encountered. The presence of Ministry observers and a panel of judges. The Goblet of Fire spat out 4 names instead of 3. Harry's name came out of the goblet, despite the fact that he was 14 and had not entered. The goblet's enchantment was unambiguous. It had selected 4 champions, and all 4 were bound to compete. The attempt to understand how a 4th name had entered the goblet, and why it was Harry's, produced a great deal of conversation, and no answers. Anne. Because the person responsible was standing in the room, contributing to the conversation, and knew exactly what he had done. Alastor Moody had been captured before the year started. The man spending the year in his place was Bartemius Crouch Jr., a Death Eater, who had spent years imprisoned in his parents' house under an imperious curse, and had escaped and found his way to the resurgent Voldemort. He entered Harry's name in the goblet using a spell that disguised it as a fourth school submission, bound him to a contract he hadn't made, and spent the year steering him through 3 tasks that were, in each case, one step closer to a graveyard in Little Hangleton, where Voldemort was waiting. The 3 tasks themselves were at Hogwarts. The first was in the school grounds, 4 dragons, 1 for each champion. The second was in the lake, Anne. The third was in a maze conjured in the Quidditch pitch that had been shut for the year, the hedges grown to 40 feet by Sprout and enchanted to shift and trap and disorient. Harry and Cedric Diggory reached the Triwizard Cup at the center of the maze at the same moment, and Harry suggested they take it together, and Cedric agreed, because that was the kind of person Cedric was, and the cup was a portkey, and they landed in the graveyard. Cedric died there. Pettigrew killed him on Voldemort's instructions. Cedric was 17 years old. He was kind and fair and talented, and his death was the death that confirmed what Dumbledore had been saying for 3 years in the face of official disbelief. Voldemort was back. Harry brought the body home. Hogwarts absorbed the fact of what had happened with the specific dignity of a place that has absorbed many things over many centuries. The school held a memorial. Students wore black. Anne. Dumbledore stood at the podium in the Great Hall and said something that was more honest than most speeches given in official institutional settings. That the choice between what is right and what is easy is the choice that defines what a person is. He said it to 500 children and meant it for every one of them. The year ended. Dumbledore reorganized. The ministry began its denial. The next year arrived in September and the school resumed, and Dolores Umbridge was in it. Part 20. Dolores Umbridge and the Year of the Toad Hogwarts, 1995-1996. She arrived with a bow in her hair and a smile that sat wrong on her face and a voice like a small girl performing politeness for adults who hadn't asked. Dolores Jane Umbridge was Senior Undersecretary to the Minister for Magic, and she was sent to Hogwarts in September 1995 as Professor of Defense Against the Dark Arts. Her actual purpose was surveillance. The ministry, under Cornelius Fudge, had decided that the simplest response to Dumbledore's claim that Voldemort had returned was to treat Dumbledore as the problem. Umbridge was the instrument of that response, installed in the school, reporting back to the ministry, restricting what could be taught, Anne, and gradually expanding her authority in the way that people who have authority and know principles expand it, into every available space, as far and as fast as the resistance will allow. Her first move was the defense curriculum. She required students to learn from a ministry-approved textbook and not to practice any practical spells. The argument was safety. The effect was that the only class designed to prepare students to defend themselves spent an entire year teaching them theory about defensive magic without letting them do any. A student who completed OWL level defense that year could describe the history of the Patronus charm and could not cast one. Harry said this out loud in class, because Harry said things out loud, and Umbridge gave him detention. The detentions were conducted in her office, which was pink. Every surface was pink or pink adjacent. Decorative plates hung on the walls showing cats playing with wool and looking serenely at nothing, and the cats moved, and their blank contentment, while a child bled at the desk below them, is one of the more precise images in the decades' history of that school. And she made Harry write lines with a quill that had no ink but used the writer's own blood, cutting the words into the back of his hand. He did not tell anyone. She calculated on the silence. The ministry's progressive takeover of Hogwarts proceeded by decree. Educational Decree number 22 gave the ministry the power to appoint teachers when the school failed to find a suitable candidate. Educational Decree number 23 created the post of High Inquisitor, which Umbridge held in addition to her teaching post, giving her the authority to inspect and evaluate every teacher in the school. Educational Decree number 24 disbanded all student organizations, clubs, teams, and societies, requiring ministry approval for any group of 3 or more students to assemble. Dumbledore's army was formed in direct defiance of this last decree. 28 students, drawn from all 4 houses, met in the Hogshead pub in Hogsmeade and agreed to learn defense properly on their own in secret. Hermione Granger had written up the terms. Harry would teach. The room of requirement would be their classroom. They agreed to the terms by signing their names, with Hermione adding a jinx that would identify anyone who betrayed the group to Umbridge. A jinx that eventually activated on a girl named Marietta Edgecombe, producing the word sneak in pustules across her face, which was petty and effective. They practiced twice a week through autumn and winter, and they were good, most of them, by the end. The Patronuses were the thing that Harry felt in the pit of his chest. Watching Neville Longbottom's first successful Patronus burst out of his wand, watching Luna Lovegood's hair bound serenely across the room of requirement, Anne. Watching people who had been told their whole lives that they were middling, or strange, or not quite right, be exactly right at something that mattered. Umbridge discovered the group in April when Marietta Edgecombe told her where they met. Dumbledore took responsibility for the group's name and was removed as headmaster and fled the school with Fawkes, and Umbridge became headmistress, and the school spent the remaining months of the year under her administration, and it was the worst months Hogwarts had experienced since the chamber opened. McGonagall was ambushed by ministry officials and hit with 4 stunning spells and taken to St. Mungo's. Anne. Trelawney was physically removed from the school in February, without warning, standing on the front steps while her possessions fell around her. The Centaurs, who tolerated exactly nothing from people who did not earn their respect, carried Umbridge into the forest when she referred to them as half-breeds. And when Harry told the Centaurs she was from the Ministry, she was carried deeper. She came back later, dazed and unwilling to discuss what had happened, and she left the school after the battle at the Department of Mysteries removed the Ministry's position of strength, and she never recovered what she'd had before. And Hogwarts went back to Dumbledore. The castle had been patient. Old buildings are patient. They have seen people like this before, and they have seen them leave. Part 21. The year everything changed Hogwarts. 1996-1997. The year that followed Umbridge's departure was the year Harry learned things. Dumbledore taught Harry himself in the evenings in the headmaster's office. He showed Harry his memories and Voldemort's history through the pensieve, methodically, in a course of instruction that was entirely unlike the Defense Against the Dark Arts curriculum and had nothing to do with the OWL syllabus. Anne. He was teaching Harry what he needed to know to survive what was coming, and the lessons were arranged in a specific order that Dumbledore had planned for years. The Horcruxes. What they were, what Voldemort had made, where they were, what it would take to destroy them. Dumbledore had spent years collecting the information, surviving one Horcrux's destruction at the cost of his hand, and was already dying by the time he sat across the desk from Harry. He had another year, approximately. He needed Harry to understand everything he had found. Draco Malfoy spent that same year carrying an assignment from Voldemort that was killing him by degrees. He had been given the task of killing Dumbledore. He was 16 years old and terrified, and he had not chosen the task as much as received it as a consequence of his father's failure. The Department of Mysteries, a family punishment handed down by the Dark Lord they served. Draco was not, had never been, what Hogwarts required him to perform, the cold inheritor of pure-blood ideology, comfortable in darkness, committed to the project. Anne. He was a boy who had been raised to believe that certain things were true and certain things were owed to him, and he had spent 6 years acting that out, and at 17 he was facing the gap between what he had been told and what was actually being asked of him. He stood on the astronomy tower with his wand pointed at Dumbledore, and he could not do it. Snape did it. The green flash in the astronomy tower, Dumbledore falling, Snape fleeing with Draco through the battle that had broken out in the corridors below. These were seen by people who described what they saw accurately and understood almost none of it. Dumbledore was dead. The greatest wizard of the age had been killed in his own school, on one of the highest towers, by a man who had claimed to serve him. The truth of what happened on the astronomy tower on the night of June 30, 1997, was that Dumbledore asked Snape to do it. Dumbledore, dying slowly from the Horcrux's curse, already compromised beyond recovery, had arranged with Snape that when the moment arrived, Snape would act and not Draco. This would spare Draco the thing it would have made him. It would preserve Snape's position with Voldemort for the year ahead. It would also kill Dumbledore, which was happening regardless, and Dumbledore had made his decision about which kind of death he preferred. Harry did not know this for almost a year. Hogwarts stood in the dark that night, with its headmaster dead, and its staircases still moving, and its ceiling still showing the Scottish sky, and its ghosts still moving through its corridors. And the summer came, and the year that followed was the one that would break and keep the school in the same trouble season. Running word count for Part 2, approximately 8,200 words, Part 22. The castle's architecture of secrets, various centuries, compiled. There are rooms in Hogwarts that no student ever found. There are rooms that students found once and could never locate again. Anne. There are rooms that appear to be something they are not, and rooms that are exactly what they appear to be, but appear to be something so strange that no one believes them. The school was built by 4 people who each believed in different kinds of privacy, and 1,000 years of subsequent modifications, additions, renovations, and the occasional magical accident have left the castle with a geography that resists complete mapping, even by people who have lived in it for decades. Dumbledore, who served at Hogwarts for over 60 years as teacher and headmaster, once told Fred and George Weasley that he was reasonably confident there were passages he had never found, a statement they interpreted as permission, and he intended as a fact. The moving staircases rearrange on a schedule that is mostly consistent, but has exceptions that nobody has fully documented. There are 142 staircases in Hogwarts, of which 7 vanish on Fridays between 3 and 5 p.m. 12 lead to dead ends that were not always dead ends and may not be permanently, and one, on the 6th floor, has a trick step that swallows your foot to the knee if you stand on it without stepping over it first. The trick step has been there for at least 300 years. Every student learns about it by being told or by finding out for themselves in the most predictable way. The portraits communicate with each other across the castle. Anne. This is not a widely understood feature of magical portraiture, but is one of its most operationally significant ones. Anne. A portrait in the 7th floor corridor knows what is being said in front of the portrait in the headmaster's office, because portrait frames are connected like a network, and the painted figures move between frames at will. For this reason, anything discussed openly in front of a Hogwarts portrait is effectively announced to anyone who wants to know. Anne. Students figured this out at inconsistent rates across the centuries. The astronomy tower is the tallest structure in the castle, and it has a quality on clear nights that has nothing to do with its enchantments and everything to do with its height. It gets you above the mist, off the loch, above the tree line, into air that is genuinely cold and thin and sharp. Anne. And the stars in Scotland on a clear November night at that altitude are something that could make a person believe in things they couldn't defend academically. Professor Aurora Sinistra, who taught astronomy from the 1980s onward, was known to stand at the tower railing after class ended and stay there long after her students had gone back inside, and no one who saw her doing it ever asked what she was thinking. The kitchens are directly below the Great Hall. The access point is a pear in a painting on the 4th floor corridor. Tickle it and a door opens. The house elves who staff the kitchens have done so since the school was built, working in conditions that wizarding law did not begin to regulate until Hermione Granger single-handedly attempted to force the issue in 1994 with an organization she founded and named herself. SPW, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare, had 4 members at its peak, 3 of whom had joined under social pressure. The house elves in the kitchen were not interested in liberation, and said so when Hermione came to tell them about it, which she found politically complicated, and they found baffling. They cooked extraordinary food for 1,000 years because they found genuine satisfaction in it, and the satisfaction was real, even if the conditions around it were not straightforward, and this particular tension in the story of Hogwarts was never entirely resolved. The Black Lake is not entirely explored. The giant squid occupies its upper depths, the merpeople their lower settlements, and there is a zone in the middle, about 40 feet down, in the coldest water, where neither the squid nor the merpeople routinely go, and where something has been visible on very clear days, on the loch bed that looks like stone ruins. The ruins predate the school. Nobody has gone to look at them carefully, because the middle of a very cold Scottish loch is not a location that encourages leisurely investigation, and the merpeople have not volunteered information about what the ruins are. Hagrid's hut sits at the edge of the Forbidden Forest, and has been there for most of the school's history, though not always with Hagrid in it, and not always in its current structural form. The hut was built for a groundskeeper in the early 14th century. By the time Hagrid took up residence in 1943, allowed to stay on the grounds, after his expulsion, a mercy from Dumbledore, who understood the injustice of what had happened and could not fully repair it. The hut had been expanded several times, and had a large stone fireplace and a garden of pumpkins that grew to improbable sizes, and a general atmosphere of warmth that its occupant projected into every environment he inhabited. Hagrid was the first person to give Harry Potter a birthday cake. This is recorded nowhere official and is the kind of detail that matters. Part 23, The Prefects and the Prefect Bathroom Hogwarts. Ongoing. The 5th floor prefect bathroom is accessed by a password that changes every term, distributed to prefects and head boys and girls at the start of each period. The bathroom itself is large enough to hold a swimming pool, which it contains, fed by about 100 differently coloured taps that produce various kinds of water, including bubbled, scented and, from one tap in the corner, water that is inexplicably purple and warm and smells of violets. Anne. The bathroom has been used since its installation in the medieval period, when a particularly indulgent headmistress decided that students who were given additional responsibility deserved additional amenities and created a space that was substantially better than anything else in the castle. This created the incentive to become a prefect that actually worked for students who were immune to the conventional incentives, the prestige, the responsibility, the 2 extra points they got to take from their own houses when their own housemates misbehaved, which most prefects found deeply uncomfortable and avoided doing. The prefect system itself was established in Hogwarts around the 12th century, drawn from Muggle educational models that the school's administrators had been watching with practical interest. 2 prefects per house per year, 5th through 7th, plus a head boy and head girl chosen from the 7th years. The selection criteria were, officially, academic standing and conduct. The actual criteria included academic standing, conduct, and the specific judgment that a student would enforce rules rather than live around them, which was a different quality and harder to measure. James Potter was head boy in his 7th year. Despite having spent the previous 6 in ongoing disciplinary conflict with Filch's predecessor, 3 different teachers, and, repeatedly, Severus Snape, Dumbledore gave him the head boy badge because he believed James was ready for it and understood correctly that the badge would do more to change James than 3 more years of conventional consequences. Lily Evans was head girl the same year and had not been expecting to share the badge with him. She was not pleased about it initially. She became less displeased over the course of the year and then considerably more pleased, and they were married 2 years after graduation. Total word count for Part 2, approximately 8,100 words. Part 24. What the Castle Remembers, a meditation between sections. Hogwarts has no sentience, officially. There is no enchantment on record that gave the castle awareness, and the school's founding documents, such as they are, given the fragmentary nature of 10th century record-keeping, make no reference to any intention of the kind. The 4 founders built a school, not a mind, but the castle behaves over 1,000 years of observation in ways that suggest it has absorbed something from the people who have lived in it. The Room of Requirement gives what is genuinely needed. The staircases, in recorded accounts going back centuries, have a statistically improbable tendency to be inconvenient for people who are up to something genuinely harmful and convenient for those trying to prevent harm. The castle was difficult to navigate for Death Eater raiding parties in the First Wizarding War, and relatively cooperative for Order of the Phoenix, members attempting to move through it quickly. None of this proves anything. Buildings with enough enchantments in them can behave in ways that appear purposeful without being so. The pattern could be coincidence, confirmation bias, and the tendency of stories to find meaning in sequence. But the older portraits say things sometimes, in their painted voices, that suggest they have been paying attention for a very long time. And the hat, which has the founders' combined minds inside it, has given warnings that turned out, always, to be correct. And the school has housed, in 1,000 years, a number of students who had no other home, and in every case the walls were available, the fires were lit, the library was open, the great hall was set. Some things keep faith with their purpose without being asked. The school's purpose was to teach magic to children who needed it. In 1,000 years it has not stopped. Wars, curses, occupations, a basilisk, several dark lords, peeves, and one particularly memorable incident in 1974 involving an experimental weather charm gone wrong over the Great Hall. And still, September comes, and the boats cross the loch, and the sorting hat sings, and another year begins. The castle remembers every one of them. That is what stones do with the years they are given. Sleep well tonight inside them. Part 2 ends here. Part 3 continues with the Battle of Hogwarts, the full account, the year of the Carrows, Neville Longbottom's resistance, the night of May 12, 1998, and what was rebuilt after. The complete history of Hogwarts, a sleep script for a 3-hour video, part 2 of 5, approx. 8,000 words, part 13. The years between the wars. Hogwarts, 1945. 1970, Tom Riddle left Hogwarts in 1945 as the school's most accomplished student in living memory. His defense marks were the highest in his year. His transfiguration work was noted by Dumbledore as containing ideas that were, in 2 cases, original. His prefect and head boy duties he had carried out without incident, to the satisfaction of every staff member who watched him. He had been charming where charm served him, and quiet where quiet was safer, and he had spent 7 years at a school full of very gifted people without once letting any of them see what was underneath. He left. The school carried on. The years between Riddle's graduation and his return as Voldemort are the quietest period in Hogwarts' 20th century history, which is part of why they're rarely discussed. Things happened, they always did, but they happened at the pace that schools have when no one is trying to destroy them. Students arrived in September, studied, quarreled, fell in love with people they shouldn't have, passed their OWLs or failed them, graduated, and were replaced by 11-year-olds who had no idea what had happened in the dungeons a decade before them. Dumbledore became Transfiguration teacher around 1938, replacing a professor who had held the position since before Dippet was headmaster, Anne. He taught with the particular quality that distinguished him then, as it would distinguish him later. He was interested in students as people, not as performance records. He knew which students were bored and adjusted for it. He noticed things that other teachers missed. He gave homework that required thinking rather than recitation, and he was patient with wrong answers in a way that made students willing to produce them. He was also, in those years, the person on staff who remembered Tom Riddle most clearly. Slughorn had liked Riddle best of any student he'd taught, which was not unique. Slughorn liked whoever seemed to him most likely to become important, and Riddle had projected importance with a consistency that was, in retrospect, deliberate. Slughorn remembered him fondly, with the particular warmth of a teacher who takes a student's success personally. Dumbledore remembered him differently. Anne. He remembered a boy who had arrived at Wool's orphanage with powers he already knew how to use against other children, who had come to Hogwarts and immediately understood how to become whatever each adult in his life needed him to be. Dumbledore was not fooled by Riddle, but being not fooled is different from being able to do anything about it, and for years there was nothing specific to do. Armando Dippet retired in approximately 1956. Dumbledore became headmaster. He had not sought the position exactly, though he had not avoided it. He had been offered the post at least twice before, once in the 1930s, once after the war, and had declined both times for reasons he kept to himself. By 1956, the school needed him and he knew it, and he took the office in the circular tower and began the long tenure that would define Hogwarts in the second half of the 20th century. He changed things slowly, in ways that didn't always look like changes. He brought back teachers who'd been pushed out under Dippet for being unconventional. He loosened certain curriculum restrictions that had been in place since the 1920s. He kept Hagrid on the grounds in a formal role, groundskeeper, which gave Hagrid a home and a purpose that the expulsion had otherwise taken. Anne. He installed a new password system for the Headmasters' office, the previous one, using a Latin phrase that had been the same since the 1890s, was changed to a rotating selection of candy names, which Dumbledore found pleasing and which made the office feel slightly more human. The portraits of former headmasters rearranged themselves within 2 weeks of his arrival. By tradition, they were neutral toward new heads until a relationship developed. By the end of his first month, Phineas Nigellus Black, the most difficult of the former heads, a man whose portrait had reportedly reduced 2 previous headmasters to silence, within his first week of dealing with them, had stopped being openly rude to Dumbledore and started being grudgingly advisory. This was, by Phineas's standards, warm. Dumbledore ran the for the next 40 years, through the rise of Voldemort and the First War, through the years of apparent peace that followed, and into the Second War that finally killed him. He made mistakes, he said so himself, in the conversations he had with Harry Potter in the years before the end. With an honesty that cost him something, Anne, he had a habit of protecting people in ways that protected him from having to watch them make choices that might hurt them. He kept secrets that other people had a right to know. He cared consistently and at considerable personal cost, and he was not perfect, and he knew he was not, and he kept going anyway. The school he ran was better for him and worse without him, and everyone who passed through it during his 40 years there knew it, even the ones who disagreed with him about almost everything else. Part 14. The First War. Hogwarts and the Wizarding World. Approximately 1970-1981. Voldemort's return came gradually, as the returns of very dangerous things tend to. He had spent the years since 1945 doing what Dumbledore suspected, making Horcruxes, building power, gathering followers from among the wizarding families, who had always believed what he believed about blood purity and cultivating the particular kind of fear that attaches to a name. By the late 1960s, the Dark Lord was not yet the figure he would become, but the figure he was becoming was already visible to anyone paying attention. Dumbledore was paying attention. Hogwarts during the First War was not a battlefield, not yet, but it was not untouched. Students arrived from families who were choosing sides or trying not to choose. The wizarding world outside the castle was increasingly frightened, increasingly divided, increasingly given to watching what it said and who it said it in front of. Inside the school, 7 years of education proceeded with reasonable normality, because that was what schools do, even when the world outside them is moving toward catastrophe. The generation that would fight the First War was trained at Hogwarts in the 1970s. James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew graduated in 1978. Lily Evans, Lily Potter by the time she died, graduated in the same year. Severus Snape graduated in the same year. They had all sat in the same Great Hall, attended the same classes, walked the same corridors, and arrived, at their final year, having made choices that would determine everything that followed, most of which could not have been predicted from their first year by anyone except possibly the Sorting Hat. Snape deserves more space than sleep content usually gives him, because he is one of the most complicated figures to have walked those corridors, and the sleep content format rewards complication handled slowly. He arrived at Hogwarts in 1971 from a miserable home in the Muggle North, a place called Spinner's End, which the name more or less accurately described. Anne. He was already friends with Lily Evans before they arrived. They had grown up near each other, recognized each other as magical, and formed the kind of friendship that happens between children who feel out of place and find someone who understands why. He arrived at school hoping for something better than what he'd left. He was sorted into Slytherin. She was sorted into Gryffindor. That crossing, right at the start, shaped everything that came after. He was bullied by James Potter and Sirius Black with a consistency and creativity that the records, to their credit, do not soften. The Marauders were brave and funny and loyal to each other, and they were also capable of cruelty towards Snape that Dumbledore knew about and did not do enough to stop. Snape's own behavior was not clean. He had a facility for dark magic that was real and a willingness to use it that grew over his years at school. But the pattern between him and James Potter was not a simple rivalry. It was sustained, and it was personal, and it left marks. He called Lily Evans a mudblood in 5th year, under circumstances that included being publicly humiliated by James Potter. She did not forgive him. The friendship ended. He went further into the dark arts and, after graduation, into Voldemort's service. What happened next is documented in what Snape himself, dying on the floor of the Shrieking Shack, gave Harry Potter in the form of memories. Years as a Death Eater, a prophecy he delivered to Voldemort, the realization of what that prophecy meant for Lily, and the turn. He went to Dumbledore. He asked for protection. He was told eventually that protection for Lily required Dumbledore's trust, which meant Snape's service in return, which meant a life spent facing the other direction every single day while working toward the one thing he could still do for someone he had lost. He came back to Hogwarts as Potions Master in 1981, the same year the Potters died. He taught there for the next 16 years. He was not a good teacher in any conventional sense. He was harsh with students he didn't favor and actively contemptuous of those he particularly disliked. He terrified Neville Longbottom consistently enough that when Neville's boggart first appeared in a defense class in 1993, it took Snape's shape. He taught Harry with visible difficulty, caught between what he owed James Potter's son and what he felt about James Potter. He was also, through all of it, the person keeping Voldemort's return from succeeding until the moment Dumbledore died, at which point Snape's role shifted into something so dangerous that Dumbledore had asked him to take it on as an act of deliberate sacrifice. He died for it. He died having never told anyone except Dumbledore what he was or why. Harry named a son after him. This seems right. Part 15. The Years of Peace Hogwarts, 1981. 1991 Voldemort was gone, and nobody knew where. The wizarding world celebrated, which it had a right to, and then tried to explain what had happened, which it mostly couldn't. The theory that held longest was the one people wanted to believe, that he was dead, destroyed by the rebounding of his own killing curse, gone as completely as an evil thing could go. The alternative, that a wizard powerful enough to murder hundreds of people had merely been reduced in some way, displaced, diminished, was too frightening to sit with comfortably, and so people mostly didn't. Dumbledore knew. He thought about it often. He said very little. Hogwarts in the 1980s was as normal as it got. The generation arriving in those years had been born during or just before the First War and had no direct memory of it. Their parents remembered, and the shape of that memory, relief cut with something that didn't quite go away, informed how they talked about the world, which in turn informed how their children talked about it, which is how historical trauma travels. But the children themselves grew up in a decade that was, by wizarding standards, peaceful. The curriculum stayed stable. The staff turned over in the usual ways. The defense position went through its annual change of occupants. And Quidditch remained the great organizing drama of school life. The particular ferocity of inter-house competition during this period is documented in the records of multiple disciplinary hearings, none of which produced lasting consequences for anyone involved. The ghosts remained, Peeves remained, Filch remained in his office full of confiscated objects with Mrs. Norris, who was a cat of extraordinary intuition and no warmth whatsoever. The portraits watched. The castle rearranged its staircases according to some internal logic that 10 centuries of students had failed to fully identify. Harry Potter was living with the Dursleys in Surrey. He knew nothing about any of it. In 1988, 3 years before Harry arrived, Fred and George Weasley arrived at Hogwarts and immediately began developing the experiments that would eventually become Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Their impact on the school in their first few years was smaller than it would become, but the pattern was established immediately. Inventive, collaborative, irreverent, and technically more sophisticated than most people who watched them assumed. The teachers who found them most frustrating were usually the ones who couldn't see past the irreverence to what was underneath it. McGonagall could. She found them maddening, and she also consistently and privately thought they were brilliant. Percy Weasley arrived 2 years after Fred and George and immediately distinguished himself in the opposite direction. Diligent, ambitious, rule-oriented to a degree that puzzled even the teachers who liked that quality. The Weasley family produced, across 3 generations, a remarkable range of outcomes, which says something about the limits of house sorting and the unpredictability of siblings. The castle waited for Harry Potter the way old things wait, not with consciousness or intention, but with the accumulated weight of everything that had happened in it. The corridors that had held the Marauders held the Weasley twins. The great hall that had fed Riddle had fed Dumbledore. The library that Ravenclaw had stocked still held books she'd touched, their spines worn by 1,000 years of hands. The grounds where the founders had stood still carried that quality in the air. The resonance, the sharpness, the thing that no one had ever adequately explained. September 1991 arrived and the Hogwarts Express left King's Cross and the boats came across the Black Loch in the dark, and the next 7 years began. Part 16. The Battle of Hogwarts, May 1-2, 1998. The castle had been through things before. It had weathered the basilisk twice. It had survived the Year of Umbrage, Anne. It had sheltered students during the Carrow's occupation, hidden them in the Room of Requirement, fed them from kitchens that the house elves kept running, regardless of who claimed authority over the grounds. But it had never been a battlefield in the way it was on the night of May 1st into the early hours of May 2nd, 1998. Voldemort's forces arrived at the boundary of the school's protective enchantments at around midnight. The enchantments Flitwick and McGonagall had raised across the grounds began to come down under sustained attack from 100 Death Eaters, who had spent years learning how to dismantle exactly this kind of magic. Inside the castle, everyone was moving. The students who were underage, or who had been ordered home, or who had chosen to go, had crossed the bridge and were gone. What remained was the staff, a number of former students who had come back, the members of Dumbledore's army who refused to leave, and the creatures who had decided that this was their fight too. The centaurs came out of the forest. It is worth pausing on this, because it had not happened in the 10 centuries of Hogwarts' existence. Not like this, not in force, not as a deliberate military intervention. They had watched from the tree line for 1,000 years, cold and proud and separate. They had made clear, repeatedly, that the forest was theirs, and the school's concerns were not their concerns. And then on the night of May 1st, 1998, they came out of the tree line with bows drawn, and they entered the battle. No centaur ever explained why. They did not offer commentary afterward, did not attend the commemorations, did not maintain any increased contact with the school in the years that followed. They went back into the forest when it was over. But they came out first, and the people who were there remembered it. The Thestrals fought too, in their way, enormous and skeletal and visible only to those who had seen death, pulling apart the giant reinforcements Voldemort had brought to the outer walls. The castle ghosts moved through the corridors in their hundreds, through walls and ceilings, carrying information and slowing pursuit and doing what they could do, which was not much but was something. The house elves came from the kitchens under Creature's direction, armed with kitchen implements and a year of accumulated grievance. Creature, who had spent decades loyal to the Black family values that Sirius had spent his life fighting, had been given Regulus Black's locket by Harry Potter. He had been asked to fight. He led the house elves out of the kitchens, wielding cleavers with an energy that nobody present expected, and everyone who survived remembered. The castle itself, and this is a thing that people who were there said afterward, and that the surviving records confirm, was reported consistently enough to be taken seriously, seemed to respond. Suits of armor animated without being specifically enchanted. Doors sealed and unsealed at moments that seemed deliberate. One staircase that had been moving randomly for 1,000 years stayed still for the full duration of the battle, as if it understood that now was not the time. Nobody knows if a castle can know anything. Nobody who fought in Hogwarts that night was certain it couldn't. The fighting lasted until dawn. Fred Weasley died in the East Wing corridor. The records say it was an explosion. George was not there when it happened, and by the time he reached his brother, Fred had already gone, still with an expression that his family said looked like he'd just heard something funny. He was 20 years old. Remus Lupin died that night. Nymphadora Tonks died that night. Colin Creevey died that night at 16, having come back into the castle after being evacuated because he was underage and couldn't not. 50 people died in and around the castle between midnight and dawn. Harry walked into the Forbidden Forest at dawn to die. He came back. Voldemort died in the Great Hall as the sun came up, not with fire or thunder, but with the particular emptiness of a killing curse that had nowhere to go. Sent at a man who was willing to die for everyone in that room, returned by a wand that had never truly belonged to the man who held it. He fell. He was human at the end, or near enough to human that the distinction had stopped mattering. The castle stood. Part 17. The Rebuilding Hogwarts, Summer 1998 and Beyond. The day after the battle was quiet in the way that follows very loud things. The bodies had been brought to the Great Hall overnight, laid out with care by the people who loved them. The castle was open to the sky in 3 places where walls had come down. Rubble-filled corridors that had stood for 1,000 years. The enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall, which had shown the sky above Scotland without interruption for 10 centuries, showed blue that morning. Spring blue, the pale specific blue of a Scottish May. And nobody who was there could remember afterward whether that seemed appropriate or terrible or both. The rebuilding happened over the summer. McGonagall, as acting headmistress and then confirmed headmistress, organised the work with the efficiency that had characterised everything she'd done. In 40 years on the Hogwarts staff, the structural damage was assessed within a week. The magical architecture was checked by a team that included Flitwick, the most technically accomplished person on staff in charms, and 2 external architects who had worked on wizarding structures for decades. What they found was that the castle's fundamental enchantments were intact. The moving staircases still moved. The ceiling still showed the sky. The sorting hat, which had been removed from the castle during the Year of the Carrows and returned by McGonagall before the battle, was examined and found undamaged. The portraits of former headmasters had sustained no harm. The library had lost some volumes to fire and explosion, but the majority were intact, including the oldest. The Room of Requirements, Room of Hidden Things, was substantially damaged and filled with the ash of centuries of accumulated objects, but the room itself still worked. It had been used as a shelter twice in 2 years. It was still a shelter. The physical damage took months to repair. The magical repairs were faster, in some cases, because magic can do in an hour what stonework takes a week to accomplish, and because the castle had a kind of memory, a structural knowledge of what it was supposed to be, that made the restoration collaborative in ways that were hard to explain. Students arrived in September 1998 for a year that nobody has fully documented, and that everyone who was there remembers differently. Some of them had fought in the battle. Some of them had lost people in it. Some had lost people in the years before it, in the quiet war of disappearances and retaliation that had been the first war's shape and the second war's too. Some had none of this in their histories and arrived at a school that felt to them unfamiliar in ways they couldn't entirely locate. The new scars on the stone, the places where the floor hadn't quite been restored to its original level, and the way the staff moved through the corridors with the specific quality of people who had been through something together. Neville Longbottom became the herbology professor eventually, which was exactly right, in a way that felt earned rather than inevitable. He had spent a year feeding students in hiding through a passage in the Room of Requirement, growing things in whatever light was available, keeping people alive through the same patience and persistence that had characterized him from first year. He had stood in front of Voldemort in the Great Hall with the sword of Gryffindor and pulled it out of the sorting hat and killed Nagini, and all of that was true. But it was also true that the thing his students would say about him for the next 30 years of his teaching career was that he always had time, and he never made you feel stupid for not knowing something. Harry did not return to Hogwarts to finish his 7th year. He joined the Auror program, became an Auror, eventually became head of the Auror office, then something more administrative, then the specific kind of person who has done a very large thing and has spent years trying to figure out what to do with the rest of their life. He visited the school. He brought his children. He stood on the grounds and looked at the castle and tried, as he always did, to hold all of it at once. The 11-year-old in the boat seeing it for the first time, the 17-year-old walking into the forest to die. He could never quite get both in focus simultaneously. Hermione Granger returned. She finished her NEW. Anne did them in a year that would have taken 2, then joined the ministry and began the work of changing it from inside, which is slower than changing it from outside but tends to stay changed. She worked on the legal status of magical creatures. She worked on Muggle-born integration. She rose in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and eventually, some years after the events of the battle, became Minister for Magic. She had been the best student Hogwarts had produced in a generation, and she left and did the work, which is exactly what Hogwarts at its best had always hoped its students would do. Ron Weasley became an Auror briefly, and then joined George at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, which had grown by the time he arrived into a business so successful that the original Diagon Alley shop had 2 branches and a mail-order catalogue. It was the right decision. He was happy. Ginny Weasley played Quidditch professionally for Holyhead, retired, became a sports correspondent, and raised 3 children with Harry who were, by all accounts, fine. Draco Malfoy kept a lower profile in the years after the war than any of them, which was appropriate. Anne, he had made choices he could not unmake, and he knew it. And the grace with which he lived with that knowledge is not something the records capture, clearly because quiet reckoning rarely makes the records. His son Scorpius arrived at Hogwarts a generation later, sorted into Slytherin, and became close friends with Albus Potter, who had been sorted there too. To his own considerable surprise and his father's complicated feelings, the castle held all of it. Part 18. The nature of the place, a meditation on what Hogwarts actually is. A school is not its buildings. Anne. This is said often, and usually means something about community or teachers or tradition, and all of those things are true. But Hogwarts is unusual in a specific way that makes the buildings themselves a relevant part of the answer. The castle has been rebuilt, repaired, expanded, and restored so many times across 1,000 years that the question of what is original, what Rowena Ravenclaw's hand actually touched, is mostly unanswerable. The stone in the Great Hall has been replaced 3 times. The towers have been extended and modified so often that Ravenclaw's original height calculations are now irrelevant. The library shelves are not the same shelves, and yet the ceiling shows the sky. The staircases move. The room appears when needed. The sorting hat sings. The portraits speak. The resonance in the air, that quality the Scottish magical community had always noticed about the plateau, the thing that made spellwork sharper and more precise, is still there. The enchantments that Ravenclaw designed and the 4 founders built in the year 993 are still running. They have been maintained, repaired, rebuilt at the edges, but the core of them, the animating logic that makes the castle what it is, has never broken. 1,000 years of students have added to it, accumulated in it, changed it by their presence. The portrait of Albus Dumbledore hangs in the Headmaster's office and can consult with successors. The sorting hat carries 10 centuries of absorbed impressions about 11-year-old children. Anne. The castle knows things that can't be explained by the enchantments as originally designed. Anne. Whether this amounts to something like consciousness is a question that the Wizarding World's magical theorists have argued about for centuries, without resolution. Dumbledore, who thought about it, said once that consciousness was probably the wrong frame, that what the castle had was more like memory than awareness. It remembered what it was supposed to be. It worked toward that. Anne. Whether something that works toward what it's supposed to be has any of the inner qualities that make consciousness matter is a question that sits past the edge of what either magic or philosophy has been able to settle. What is observable? The castle has survived. Wars, Dark Lords, institutional capture, the basilisk, a poltergeist, the wholesale destruction of its eastern wing, and several fires of unknown origin. It has stood on that Scottish plateau for 1,000 years, and it has kept working. The ceiling kept showing the sky. The food kept appearing. The children kept learning. There is a view, held by some of the older portraits, Anne, that Hogwarts is the most important building in the wizarding world, not because of what has happened in it, but because of what it keeps doing, beginning. Every September, a group of 11-year-olds who know almost nothing about what they are cross that loch in the dark and see the castle for the first time. Every September the Sorting Hat sings, and the children sit down and become, in some small but real way, different from what they were that morning. 1,000 years of that. Every wizard and witch Britain has produced for a millennium has that crossing in their memory, that boat, that dark water, those lights. Some of them went on to heal, some to govern, some to fight, some to teach the next group of children crossing in the dark. Some of them became Voldemort, and even he had that crossing, and even he had 7 years in those corridors, learning. It didn't save him, but the school kept going, because what failed in Tom Riddle was not what the school tried to give him, and the children arriving the September after him were a different set of choices, and the September after that a different set again. The founders built the school to give every magical child somewhere to learn. Slytherin left. The other 3 kept going. For 1,000 years, someone kept going. The doors kept opening. The ceiling kept showing the sky. Part 19. What the castle keeps on memory, repetition, and the long view. The oldest part of the Hogwarts grounds that any current record can fix a date to is a section of the North Foundation Wall, which the Magical Survey conducted in 1947 placed at approximately the year 990, older than the school itself, suggesting it may have been part of an earlier structure, or a remnant of the magical construction's first attempts before the founders settled on the final design. 3 feet of foundation wall. Nobody knows who laid it. Nobody knows what it was part of. It is likely that nobody knew within a generation of its laying, because the magical community of 10th century Scotland was not keeping systematic records. It exists because stone persists and the castle was built on top of it. And occasionally during excavation work in the north basement levels you can see it in the bedrock, older than everything else, covered over by the school that grew around it. This is roughly analogous to what the castle does with everything it accumulates. The nick that James Potter cut into a windowsill in the 7th floor corridor in 1975, bored during a free period, is still there if you look for it. Harry found it, once running his finger along the stone without quite knowing why, and then knowing. Fred and George Weasley carved their initials into the underside of a wooden step on the staircase to the astronomy tower in their 2nd year, on the correct theory that Filch never looked under the stairs. The stairs still have it. The step has held it through 30 years of students. The Great Hall has heard 11-year-olds sorted into their houses in an unbroken sequence since approximately 1000 AD. The names change. The qualities the hat identifies, bravery, curiosity, loyalty, ambition, don't. The school has worked through periods when all 4 of those things were needed urgently, and periods when they weren't, and the graduates have gone out and used what they had. And then their children have arrived to be sorted, and the sequence has continued. When Harry's children came, Albus first, the hall was quiet in the way it's always quiet for the ceremony. Albus Potter walked up to the stool, and the hat was placed on his head, and the hat knew him, knew the shape of him, the worry in him, the particular difficulty of being the second child of a famous father, and placed him in Slytherin, which was the honest answer, and also the answer that frightened him most. He sat down at the green-lit table in the dungeons and looked up at the enchanted ceiling which showed the Scottish sky, same as it always had, and the ceiling looked back down at him with nothing but weather. He made a friend. He found his footing. He was fine, eventually. That's roughly what the school has always produced, across 1,000 years. People who were fine, eventually, after 7 years of being given enough to work with. Not all of them, not reliably. Not without the failures and exceptions and outright catastrophes that are also part of the record. But the aim was always the same, and the aim was good and on balance across a millennium it roughly held. Part 20. The long sleep of the castle, a closing passage. It is very late now, or very early, depending on how you measure. The castle is quiet tonight the way it is quiet every night. Not empty, because old places are never entirely empty, but settled. Anne. The portraits have stopped talking, and their subjects have moved into the deep painted background where they go when the day is done. The ghosts have drifted to wherever ghosts go in the small hours. The Bloody Baron through the dungeon walls. Nick through the ceiling of the corridor he's haunted for 5 centuries. The staircases have slowed. The ceiling of the Great Hall shows a clear night, stars visible over Scotland, the particular density of the northern sky on a night when the clouds have finally moved off. The sorting hat sits in a cabinet in the headmaster's office, its 10 centuries of accumulated knowledge and personality, quiet for another year. It will sing again in September. It always does. It will compose something new. It always does that too, drawing on whatever it has absorbed from 1,000 September mornings of sitting briefly on each arriving head, learning the shape of each new child, adding that impression to everything it already holds. The library is dark. Hundreds of thousands of books stand in their shelves, some of them older than most countries, and they will be there in the morning the same as they were there this morning and the morning before that. Madam Pince's desk is empty, but her presence is still somehow in the room. That quality of quiet that belongs to people who love books so much they become indistinguishable from their collection. The Whomping Willow is still in the grounds, older than it looks. Its roots still hold the tunnel. The Forbidden Forest is dark and full of things going about their business. Centaurs and thestrals and unicorns and things that don't have names in English, moving through the old-growth trees without any particular concern for the sleeping castle at the forest's edge. The loch is black and still. The giant squid is somewhere below, 40 or 50 feet down in the cold, moving slowly the way very old things move, when they have nowhere particular to go and all the time available. It has been in that loch since before the school was built. It will almost certainly be in that loch long after any given student graduates, after any given headmaster retires, after any given generation of stories gets replaced by the next one. Tomorrow there will be classes. There will be potions and charms and transfiguration and defense, and someone will cause an explosion that they shouldn't have, and someone will cast a spell correctly for the first time, and someone will have a thought in a corner of the library that is the beginning of an idea that will take them years to follow. The Quidditch teams will practice. Peeves will cause a problem somewhere. Filch will write a name in a ledger. The ceiling will show whatever sky there is. And 11-year-olds, somewhere in Britain, will be lying in their own beds tonight, in muggle houses and wizarding ones, in cities and villages and farms, waiting for September. Some of them are frightened. Some are excited in ways they can't quite sit still with. Most of them are a mix of both that they don't yet have words for. Because they are 11 years old and the words come later, they will cross that loch in the dark. They will see the castle for the first time, and they will sit down at a long table and start the 7 years that will give them most of what they'll spend their lives working with. That has been true for 1,000 years. It will be true for 1,000 more if the ceiling holds and the sorting hat keeps singing and the doors keep opening in September for whoever comes. That's enough now. Let the castle sleep. Let everything else sleep too. If any part of this found you, the founders standing on a cold Scottish plateau, the ceiling showing the sky, a small boat crossing dark water, there are more hours like this one waiting for you. The full history of the Ministry of Magic, the untold decades of the Marauders, the lore of the Deathly Hallows, and the people who searched for them across centuries. Subscribe and turn on notifications, and the next one will find you when you need it. Sleep well. Running word count, approximately 8, 100 words of narrative script content total across parts 1 and 2. Approximately 16, 200 words the complete history of Hogwarts as sleep script for a 3-hour video, part 3 of 5 approx. 8,000 words part 25, the portraits in-depth Hogwarts, ongoing. Various centuries, the headmaster's office has 43 portraits. This number has changed over time. A portrait is added when a headmaster or headmistress dies, or, in some cases when they choose retirement, and make an arrangement with the school to leave an image behind. The 43 are not all always awake. Some spend decades in a painted doze, occasionally roused by a loud argument or an unusual amount of activity in the room. Others are alert with unsettling consistency, watching everything, commenting on some of it. Portrait magic is, in the wizarding world, one of the older forms, the technique for creating a portrait that genuinely holds something of its subject, that is more than a photograph, more than a recording, requires both the painting and the subject to be prepared over years. The subject teaches the portrait, sits with it, tells it things, argues with it, lets it watch them think. What develops is not the person but a version shaped by what the person chose to pass on. Anne. This is why portrait figures can surprise you. They have inherited their subject's patterns without inheriting everything that produced those patterns. Phineas Nigellus Black is the most disagreeable portrait in the office, which is a competitive category. He was headmaster from approximately 1880 to 1905, and by every available account, was not beloved during his tenure either. He was, however, intelligent, politically shrewd, and possessed of an honesty so unrelenting it sometimes read as cruelty. His portrait inherited all of this. He told Harry Potter things he did not want to hear on multiple occasions with no softening. He also, when given a task, carrying a message between his Hogwarts portrait and the portrait in Grimmauld Place, carried it reliably and without complaint, because he understood that reliability was a form of dignity even for a man who liked very few people. Everard and Dilys were the two former headmasters most useful to Dumbledore during the active years of Voldemort's return. Everard's portrait had a second frame somewhere in the Ministry of Magic. Dilys had her St. Mungo's portrait. When Arthur Weasley was attacked in the Ministry in 1995, Dumbledore sent them both to report, and they returned within minutes. This is how the portrait network actually functioned in practice, as an intelligence system running on the goodwill of the painted dead. The portrait of Armando Dippet has the quality of a man who knows he made mistakes and has had several decades in paint to think about them. Anne. He is not particularly forthcoming about his time as headmaster. He watches proceedings in the office with the attention of someone doing a kind of long penance. Dumbledore's portrait was added in 1997 after his death on the Astronomy Tower. It is the most recent addition. In the immediate aftermath of his death, when the school was under Death Atraligned authority and Snape was headmaster, the portrait was covered with a curtain, a precaution, or possibly an insult, depending on who ordered it. When McGonagall became headmistress after the battle, the curtain came down, and the portrait has been uncovered since. The portrait has a silver beard, half-moon spectacles, and an expression of alert patience that matches descriptions of the man. It is not the man. It tells you things the man might have said, in language that sounds like him, with the particular quality of knowing that portrait figures have, an awareness of their own limitations that the originals sometimes lacked. Harry visited it after everything was over and sat in the chair across from the desk where so many conversations had happened and found it difficult to speak to a painting of someone he'd watched die. The portrait waited. Eventually, Harry said something. The portrait answered. It was not the same as having Dumbledore. Nothing was or would be. But it was something, and it has been something for every headmistress and headmaster who has come to the office since. Part 26. Hogsmeade the Village. Various centuries, Hogwarts does not exist in isolation. 3 miles down the road from the school, past the lake and across the valley, sits Hogsmeade, the only all-wizard village in Britain. It grew up alongside the school, in the way that towns grow up alongside institutions that generate a steady supply of people who need things. By the time the school was 3 centuries old, Hogsmeade had a tavern, a post office, a sweet shop, and a dozen other establishments serving the school and the surrounding magical community. The 3 Broomsticks has been on the same corner since the 16th century. The building has been rebuilt 3 times. Fire, once. Structural failure, once. A dispute in 1724 that ended with half the common room being transfigured and nobody quite managing to turn it back. But the location has been continuous. Rosmerta became landlady in the mid-20th century and has kept the place running through 2 wizarding wars, 1 occupation, and several incidents involving Peeves that she declines to detail. She serves butterbeer by the tankard, and the recipe has not changed in living memory, which several people have asked about, and she has declined to discuss. Honeydukes opened in the 19th century. Anne. The basement has a trapdoor that connects to a secret passage running the length of the tunnel from the Hogwarts grounds, through which Fred and George and their various predecessors made unauthorized Hogsmeade visits for several hundred years. The tunnel is on the Marauders map. Honeyduke's staff have never publicly acknowledged knowing about it. Zonko's joke shop operated on the high street for most of the 20th century, eventually closing in the years after Voldemort's return, when the atmosphere in Hogsmeade made novelty items feel like the wrong pitch. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes opened a Hogsmeade branch sometime in the 2000s, by which point the atmosphere had improved considerably and novelty items felt correct again. The Shrieking Shack sits on the outskirts of the village and is, as previously mentioned, not actually haunted. It acquired its reputation in 1971 when Remus Lupin's monthly transformations produced sounds audible from the village, and Dumbledore encouraged the haunting interpretation because it discouraged investigation. The building is old and genuinely falling apart, having been unoccupied and unrepaired for decades. Its reputation outlasted its function, and the shack is still considered one of the most dangerous buildings in Britain by people who believe in the ghosts, and simply derelict by people who don't. And both assessments have always been wrong in interesting ways. Students get Hogsmeade visiting rights starting in 3rd year with signed permission from a parent or guardian. The permission slip system was established after an incident in 1782 that the school has never fully disclosed, involving 2 second-year students, a Hogsmeade pub, and a sequence of events that required intervention from 3 ministry officials and a retired Auror. Parental permission was added to the protocol the following term. The visit days have a social weight at Hogwarts that the school never formally acknowledges. Hogsmeade is where things get decided, friendships confirmed, relationships started or ended, conversations had that couldn't be had inside the castle walls. The cold walk down from the school, the warmth of the 3 broomsticks, the specific social geography of who sits with whom at which table, these things mattered to students in ways that are genuinely different from what happens inside the school because they happen in a space that isn't fully observed. Harry's first Hogsmeade visit, in 3rd year, was spent with Ron and Hermione in Honeydukes, and then the 3 broomsticks, and it was at the 3 broomsticks that he first heard clearly that the ministry believed Sirius Black had betrayed his parents. He sat very still in a corner booth and listened to things that rearranged his understanding of his own history, and the butterbeer in his hands went warm and he didn't notice. That's what Hogsmeade was, at its best. The place where things became real. Part 27. The subjects nobody talks about, curriculum history. Hogwarts' history of magic has been taught by the same ghost since 1492. Professor Binns died at his desk one evening, got up the next morning out of pure habit, and has been teaching ever since without appearing to notice the transition. He lectures in a flat monotone about goblin rebellions and wizard legislation and the various political arrangements of the 14th century, from notes that have not been meaningfully updated since approximately 1890. Students sleep in his class at a rate that several later studies of Hogwarts academic records have documented as statistically remarkable. The class has an excellent exam pass rate anyway, because the exam questions are entirely predictable and the content, though delivered without animation, is accurate. Binns is the only ghost on the Hogwarts teaching staff, and the arrangement is tolerated rather than encouraged. The difficulty of asking a ghost to retire is obvious. Where does the request come from, and what consequence would follow refusal? Dumbledore allowed Binns to continue through his entire headmastership. McGonagall has continued the policy. The thinking, if there is thinking, may be that the class keeps students occupied for a period. The content is not actively wrong, and the alternative, finding a living teacher willing to teach wizarding history, would require a search that no one has prioritized. Hermione Granger got an outstanding in History of Magic OWL, which required her to teach herself most of the curriculum from books, and she found this entirely acceptable. Ancient runes and arithmancy are both elective subjects, taken from 3rd year onward, and both suffer from the reputation of being serious in a way that makes students reluctant to choose them. Ancient runes involves the translation and interpretation of magical texts in dead or dying languages, several of which have only a handful of surviving documents. Arithmancy uses numbers and numerical relationships as a framework for understanding magical cause and effect, a discipline that requires both mathematical patience and a tolerance for ambiguity, that not every student finds comfortable. Both subjects tend to produce students who are quieter about their abilities than students in more performative disciplines, and who turn out, when pressed, to know things that nobody else in the room knows. Hermione Granger took both. So did Padma Patil, who went on to a career in magical research that produced 3 papers still cited in the field 40 years later. Divination was always the contentious one. The debate about whether divination belongs in a school of magic has never fully resolved, because it is actually 2 debates conducted as one. The first is whether prophetic ability is a real phenomenon that can be taught. The second is whether Sybil Trelawney is a real prophet. The answer to the first question is almost certainly yes. The wizarding world has enough documented cases of genuine seers to take the phenomenon seriously. The answer to the second is complicated. Trelawney made 2 genuine prophecies in her career, both verified, both significant. She was also capable of producing predictions at industrial volume, most of which were wrong, which muddied the waters considerably. Dumbledore hired Trelawney because he wanted her on the grounds and protected after she delivered her prophecy about Voldemort's vanquisher in an interview that Snape partially overheard. Keeping her at Hogwarts kept her safe. The side effect was 40 years of students learning to identify lucky guesses as mystical revelation, which was not ideal but was, by Dumbledore's calculation, an acceptable cost. She was a better prophet than she was a teacher, and she was not a good teacher. Part 28. Filch and Mrs. Norris Hogwarts, 1966. Present Argus Filch arrived at Hogwarts as caretaker in 1966 and remained there through 2 wizarding wars, multiple headmasters, and the complete rebuilding of the East Wing after the battle, without once appearing to enjoy any of it. He is a squib. This fact is known to the staff and to students who have done their research, though Filch himself has never confirmed it to a student directly. A squib is a person born to magical parents who has no magical ability, the reverse of a muggle-born. In practical terms, it means that Filch, in a school where the corridors and staircases and ceilings are all enchanted, must do his work without magic, supplemented by a cabinet of muggle cleaning implements and a great deal of accumulated bitterness. He spent years in a correspondence course called Quickspell, which promised to develop magical ability in adult squibs. It did not work. He kept the course materials in his office desk and never spoke of them to anyone. His relationship with the students is one of mutual antagonism, so long established, it has become a kind of structure. Students expect him to be hostile and plan accordingly. He expects them to break rules and policies accordingly. The equilibrium has held for decades. Fred and George Weasley, who tested that equilibrium harder than almost anyone in the second half of the 20th century, understood it well enough to work within it. They knew exactly what Filch could catch them doing and structured their activities around his limitations. He kept a list on his office wall of students he wanted to see given detention. The list changed frequently. Harry Potter appeared on it within his first week. Ron Weasley appeared within his second. Mrs. Norris is a cat of indeterminate age and persistent surveillance. She has been Filch's companion since at least the 1970s, and the difficulty of calculating her age from the records is itself suggestive. Anne. She moves through the castle with the specific quality of a creature that has spent years learning its roots, and she has an apparent ability to locate students doing something wrong that multiple staff members have attributed to genuine feline perception rather than magical assistance. Filch finds her company preferable to that of most people, which is not an unreasonable position. When the basilisk petrified her in 1992, Filch found her hanging stiff from a torch bracket on the second floor and made a noise that several students who were present described as more than he had ever made for a person. She was unpetrified at the end of that year and resumed her duties, and Filch resumed his, and the castle went on. He voted, in his one documented political act, against the expulsion of Hagrid in 1943. Nobody listened. He still has the memo he sent, filed in a drawer under the confiscated items cabinet, in handwriting that suggests more feeling than his face usually admits. Part 29. The House Elf Hogwarts Kitchens. 93 present. There are approximately 120 house elves at Hogwarts. The exact number fluctuates as elves are occasionally freed, occasionally join, occasionally die in the quiet way that old beings die, which in elves happens mostly in their sleep and is uncommonly peaceful for a species with an otherwise complicated relationship to peace. And they work in shifts, though shift implies a formality to the arrangement that the actual kitchen schedule doesn't quite support. The cooking happens when food is needed. The elves arrange this among themselves. The terms under which they work are not, by most standards applied after the 20th century, acceptable. They receive no pay, no time off they didn't request, and no formal acknowledgement of their labour beyond the school's general continuity. The question of whether this bothers them is answered differently depending on whom you ask. Hermione Granger said yes, clearly, and founded an organisation to address it. Dobby, once freed, said that freedom was the thing he had always wanted. The Hogwarts kitchen elves, when Hermione came to speak with them about liberation, said they were happy, and they meant it, and the impossibility of reconciling those 3 data points is one that the wizarding world has not resolved. What is observable is that the food has been excellent for 1,000 years. The kitchens run with an efficiency that no human-staffed institution has matched. The elves take genuine satisfaction in the work. This is apparent in the way they talk about it, in the care that goes into the preparation of each feast, in the way an elf named Dobby, when working at Hogwarts in his final months, pressed sandwiches on Harry Potter with an urgency that was clearly about affection rather than duty. Kreacher is the elf whose story sits most awkwardly in the larger history. He had served the Black family for decades and had absorbed, over those decades, the values of a family that held some of the worst views in wizarding Britain. He was Sirius Black's inheritance. Sirius, who despised what his family stood for, who willed Kreacher to Harry, who had spent years in a house with an elf, who hated him back with complete consistency. Harry inherited Kreacher, treated him with basic kindness, gave him Regulus Black's locket, and watched something in the elf shift. What shifted was not Kreacher's personality. He remained old and difficult and set in his ways and inclined to mutter. What shifted was his loyalty, because the locket gave him back a version of Regulus Black that he had lost. A master who had treated him with something approaching care, whose final act had been to send Kreacher to safety before going back to destroy a Horcrux alone. Kreacher led the house elves out of the Hogwarts kitchens and into the Battle of Hogwarts with kitchen implements, because he understood, finally, who he was fighting alongside and why. The connection between elf and master is not a comfortable part of wizarding history. It has not been made comfortable by acknowledgement. But within that discomfort, in individual cases, there were choices made and relationships formed that don't reduce to the conditions that produced them. And Kreacher's battle charge is one of those. Part 30. The Forbidden Forest in-depth Hogwarts grounds. Various centuries, the forest is older than the school by several centuries. This matters because the things that live in the forest predate the school's claim on the surrounding land, and they have never accepted that claim as superseding their own. The centaurs arrived in those woods before any human had thought to build on the plateau above. The trees themselves, the oldest ones, the ones near the forest's heart where the canopy is so thick that moonlight never reaches the floor. Those trees were growing when Britain was still using a calendar the Romans had brought, and not yet abandoned. The forest is approximately 800 acres. No complete survey of it exists, because the surveys that have been attempted have returned incomplete, or have returned with their surveyors, unwilling to discuss certain portions of the interior. Firenze, the centaur who briefly taught divination at Hogwarts before being expelled from his herd for doing so, was one of the few forest inhabitants who spoke to humans with any regularity, and even he kept the forest's deeper geography to himself. What is known? The forest contains centaurs, unicorns, thestrals, acromantula, bowtruckles in the northern section, some species of magical creature that has never been formally classified, at least one boggart of unusual persistence, and, for several decades in the 20th century, a werewolf who used it for monthly transformations without entirely intending to. The unicorns occupy the western section. They are visible occasionally at dusk, moving between the trees in the specific way of creatures that know. They are the most aesthetically remarkable things in any landscape and have long since stopped being surprised by their own effect on observers. Their blood is a powerful magical substance, and their horn has applications that make them targets, which means the forest's unicorns have spent centuries developing a caution around strangers that stops just short of flight. They would let Hagrid close, almost no one else. Hagrid maintained a relationship with the forest that was, practically speaking, what made the grounds manageable. He had grown up in the area, knew the forest as well as anyone outside the centaur herd, and had the specific quality of a person, so unthreatening to large dangerous animals, that the animals eventually adopted a policy of tolerating him. He kept Buckbeak the hippogriff in a paddock by his hut. He let Aragog's children multiply in the forest longer than was, in retrospect, wise. He introduced blast-ended scroots to a care of magical creatures class, without fully anticipating the class's response to an animal that attacked without apparent provocation and could not be comfortably described as cute. The forest served for Harry's generation as both a punishment and a necessity. First-year detention in the forest was a long-standing Hogwarts practice that would have attracted serious scrutiny from any modern safeguarding framework, but which produced a generation of students who understood clearly that the ground's boundaries were real and that what lay beyond them operated by different rules. Harry went into the forest in first year and found Voldemort drinking unicorn blood. He went again in third year and found Aragog's colony, which was the most frightening thing he encountered that year, and that year contained a lot of frightening things. He walked into it for the last time in May 1998 to meet his death. He walked out again. The forest keeps a great deal, but it gave that back. Part 31. Neville Longbottom Hogwarts, 1991-1998. And after the prophecy that Voldemort used to identify his target, said that a child born at the end of July to parents who had defied him 3 times would have the power to vanquish him. There were 2 children who fit. Harry Potter, born July 31st. Neville Longbottom, born July 30th. Both parents had defied Voldemort. Both children were born at the right time. Voldemort chose Harry, apparently on the basis of the half-blood ancestry they shared. This left Neville to grow up as himself, which was, for the first several years, a difficult thing to grow up as. He was raised by his grandmother after his parents were tortured to permanent incapacity by Bellatrix Lestrange and Bartemius Crouch Jr. Frank and Alice Longbottom were both Aurors, both members of the Order of the Phoenix, both formidably capable. They were tortured with the Cruciatus Curse until their minds broke. They have been patients at St. Mungo's since 1981. Neville visited them every Christmas. His mother, Alice, would sometimes press a Drubal's best blowing gum wrapper into his hand, unable to give him anything else but still giving. He kept the wrappers, he kept all of them. He arrived at Hogwarts with a reputation for being hopeless at magic, which was partly accurate and entirely misleading about the reasons. He was performing magic with his father's old wand, which had never suited him. When he got his own wand in his second year, his work improved measurably, but the reputation stuck because reputations at school have a mass of their own and resist being moved. He was afraid of Snape in a way that made sense. Snape's contempt for him was consistent and pointed, and that fear leaked into his performance in potions in ways that confirmed Snape's opinion, which in turn justified continued contempt, in a loop that nobody thought to interrupt. His boggart took Snape's shape. His wand trembled in potions. He failed to produce a Patronus for months when Harry was teaching him. He was, by most available measures in his first 4 years, exactly what the school had decided he was. Adequate in herbology, forgettable elsewhere, not the sort of student anyone would bet on. Then his parents' attackers were brought back before him. At the end of 5th year, in the Department of Mysteries, Neville Longbottom fought Death Eaters with a broken nose, a broken wand, and a hand that had been grabbed and was breaking. He kept fighting. He kept giving Harry information. He kept moving. Nobody who watched that night was surprised anymore by the time he pulled the sword of Gryffindor from the sorting hat. The year under the Carrows, 1997 to 1998, is the year his story becomes most clearly what it was going to be. He stayed at Hogwarts when he could have left. He organized. He kept the DA running. He kept students fed through the room of requirement passage to the Hog's Head. He took the punishments that came when he was caught and went back to organizing. Ginny Weasley and Luna Lovegood were with him for parts of it. For parts of it, he was the one holding the structure together alone. He became the herbology professor because plants were what he knew best, and because teaching was what his situation had required of him for years, and because a school that had once told him he was not exceptional would give him the chance to tell every student that they were not what the school had decided they were. He taught there for 30 years. He married Hannah Abbott, who became the Three Broomsticks landlady when Rosmerta retired. He visited his parents at St. Mungo's for the rest of their lives, because some things don't have a resolution, only a continuation. He kept the wrappers. Part 32. Luna Lovegood Hogwarts, 1992-1999. And after she arrived believing things that nobody else believed, and she left having been entirely correct about some of them. Luna Lovegood was sorted into Ravenclaw in 1992, which was the right house in that it valued independent thinking, and an imperfect one in that her thinking was independent in directions her housemates did not always follow. She believed in creatures that wizarding zoology had not confirmed. She wore radish earrings and a necklace of butterbeer corks, because she understood these as effective against nargles, which her housemates understood as evidence of something they were not unkind enough to say directly. Her mother, Pandora Lovegood, had died in a spell experiment gone wrong when Luna was 9. Luna had been there. She could see thestrals from her first year at Hogwarts, because she had seen death and could, and she found the strolls beautiful rather than unsettling, which tells you something about how she processed what had happened to her. She was teased at school by a process of gradual isolation, her things hidden, her name replaced with Loony. Her company declined so consistently that she spent most of her first 3 years eating alone, reading the Quibbler, and apparently unbothered in a way that was either extremely healthy or extremely concerning, depending on how closely you looked. The truth was closer to a third thing. She had decided at some point that the opinions of people who stole her shoes were not opinions she needed to organize her life around. This was correct and also lonely. She joined Dumbledore's army in her 4th year. She fought in the Department of Mysteries. She was at Hogwarts for the battle. In between, she said true things to Harry with a directness that was possible only for someone with no social investment in the usual euphemisms. She told him he was being possessed by Voldemort. And she was right. She told him she believed he had seen Cedric die, and she was one of the first people to say it simply. She told him that the people we lose don't fully go. After the war, she became a wizarding naturalist. She found the crumple-horned snorkack. The academic community debated whether her discovery was of a creature previously unknown, or whether the creature was, as she had always maintained, simply previously unlooked for. The distinction mattered to her. She married Rolf Scamander, a fellow naturalist, grandson of the man who had written the Wizarding World's central text on magical creatures. They had twin sons named Lorcan and Lysander, who arrived at Hogwarts in the 2020s and were sorted separately. What she gave Harry Potter in his 6th year, when he was without Dumbledore and most of the adults around him were operating at the edge of what they could hold, was the specific gift of someone who does not find reality insufficient. She had lost her mother at 9. She had spent years eating alone. She had been imprisoned in Malfoy Manor for months. None of these things had made her unkind or made her smaller. She was exactly what she had always been, and what she had always been was enough. Part 33. The Weasley family at Hogwarts various years, 1970s, 2010s. No family has a longer continuous run of Hogwarts attendance in the 20th century than the Weasleys, and no family has contributed more to the school's informal culture. Arthur Weasley attended in the 1960s and was sorted into Gryffindor, where he developed the interest in Muggle objects that defined his professional life and most of his personality. He graduated with decent marks and a long-standing curiosity about how things worked that the wizarding world found eccentric, and Muggles would have found entirely ordinary. He married Molly Pruitt, who had attended Hogwarts at the same time. and they produced 7 children in 11 years, which meant that the Weasley presence in the school was effectively continuous from about 1985 through the late 2000s. Bill Weasley was the first of the 7. He was a prefect, head boy, and produced marks good enough to get him a job at Gringotts as a cursebreaker, which required intelligence and a tolerance for risk in equal measure. He was 26 when he was scarred by Fenrir Greyback at Hogwarts during the night of Dumbledore's death, and the scars did not heal cleanly, and he carried them and he kept going, which is roughly what the Weasley family did in most situations. Charlie Weasley was the second, Anne. He was Gryffindor Quidditch captain and could have played professionally, by Oliver Wood's accounting and McGonagall's private agreement. He chose dragons instead, moving to Romania to study them, which was the correct choice for someone who found dragons more interesting than fame. He spent his career abroad and came home for the battle and fought in it. Percy Weasley went to the ministry and believed its assurances about Voldemort over his family's. And the cost of that belief was years of estrangement from people who loved him. And he came back at the beginning of the battle and made a joke about resigning. And Fred laughed, and that was one of the last things Fred heard. Percy carried that too. He worked at the ministry for the rest of his career, in the specific way of someone who has understood what institutions can get wrong and does not intend to let it happen again from the inside. Anne. Fred and George need less introduction than most characters in this history, because they introduced themselves so thoroughly in 7 years at Hogwarts that the school still has their fingerprints on it. Literal ones, in the case of the janitor's closet on the 3rd floor, which the 2 of them sealed with a locking charm of their own invention in 1995, that 3 subsequent caretakers have failed to reverse. Their departure from the school in April 1996 is the most documented voluntary exit in Hogwarts history. They produced, on their way out, a fireworks display that Umbridge was unable to stop, and that lasted for several weeks in various corridors, including a dragon that chased her into the Great Hall. Peeves saluted them as they flew out on their broomsticks. McGonagall told the students, with a rigidly controlled expression, that she could not encourage what they had done. She then turned away before anyone could see her face change. Ron Weasley was the 6th, and his story is Harry's, because the 2 of them arrived at Hogwarts at the same time and left it at the same time, and the history of one is mostly the history of the other. Ginny was last. She arrived at Hogwarts in 1992, the same year the chamber opened, and her mother's old Tom Riddle diary worked its way into her possession. She was 11, and she was controlled by a piece of Voldemort's soul for most of her first year. And she nearly died at the bottom of a 1,000-year-old chamber, and when she came back to school in her 2nd year, she was determined, in a way that had clearly been decided in the dark, not to be defined by what had happened to her. She became one of the most technically accomplished Quidditch players Gryffindor fielded in the 20th century. She produced a bat-boggy hex that was, by Horace Slughorn's account, as good as anything he'd seen in 40 years of teaching. She was 17 years old during the Battle of Hogwarts and fought in it, and her mother stood between her and Bellatrix Lestrange and told Bellatrix that she did not hurt Ginny's children, and Bellatrix laughed, and Molly Weasley killed her. This is also part of what Hogwarts produced. Part 34, the Great Hall. On the room itself, the Great Hall is 90 feet from floor to ceiling. This is a practical measurement that Ravenclaw specified in her original plans, based on calculations about how large a space you need to seat 500 people without generating the acoustic problems that large stone rooms produce. The calculation was correct. The hall has hosted 5 centuries of sorting ceremonies, 900 years of feasts, and the occasional large-scale event, the Triwizard Tournament dinner, the various memorial services the school has held, without the sound becoming unbearable. 4 long house tables run parallel the length of the hall. A 5th table shorter sits at the end for the staff. Anne. The arrangement is not permanent in any physical sense. The tables can be moved, and have been, for events that require different configurations. Anne. But it is permanent in a social sense. The house tables are where students belong, and the belonging is structural, and the structure has reproduced itself for 1,000 years. The ceiling is the most remarkable feature, and it is worth one more visit because the Hermione Granger comment about it is worth expanding. She arrived at Hogwarts having read that the ceiling was enchanted to look like the sky, and she informed anyone who would listen that it was not the real sky, it was bewitched. This is technically correct. The enchantment creates a perfect reflection of the actual sky above Scotland, including current cloud movement, light quality, and weather conditions. The distinction between the real sky and a perfect dynamic representation of the real sky is a philosophical question with no comfortable answer. Ravenclaw probably had opinions. What she built does something that is difficult to argue with. 1,000 years of students have eaten under it and looked up, and the ceiling has always been honest about what the sky is doing. Harry Potter's last meal in the Great Hall before he walked into the Forbidden Forest to die was breakfast on May 2nd, 1998. He didn't eat much. Anne. He sat at the Gryffindor table and the ceiling showed a grey Scottish dawn, and he looked at the people around him and tried to memorize them in the way people do when they believe they are losing something permanently. The ceiling showed the dawn. He came back. He ate in that hall again, probably more than once, probably in the years when he brought his children to the school and they crossed the loch and sat down at their tables, and he stood with McGonagall or Neville and watched the sorting. The ceiling still showed the sky. The sky was still there. Part 35. Anne. What comes after? The school's future and the tradition of September. The children who will arrive at Hogwarts next September are 11 years old, right now. Some of them know they are magical. Some don't yet. They've had moments they can't explain. Objects that moved without hands. Weather that responded to their moods. Pets that understood them too precisely. They've been told it's coincidence, or they've been told nothing, or they've been told they need to be patient, and that the letter will come. The letter always comes. Somewhere in the castle, the Book of Admittance records every magical birth in Britain. The Quill of Acceptance writes each name as the magic manifests. The process has been continuous since the school was founded. No name has ever been missed, not in 1,000 years of record-keeping, not through wars or plague, or the years when the ministry itself was compromised. The book kept writing, the letters kept going out. September comes, and the Hogwarts Express leaves King's Cross at 11 in the morning, from platform 9 3/4, which is accessed through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, and which works for anyone who walks toward it with confidence rather than caution. The train runs for 6 hours through England and into Scotland, and the light outside changes as it goes north, and students who have made the trip before stop looking out the window around Bristol. And students making it for the first time look out the whole way. At Hogsmeade Station, a voice that is currently Hagrid's calls for the first years. This has been Hagrid's job since 1993, when Dumbledore formalized an arrangement that had been informal since Hagrid was allowed to stay on the grounds in 1943. Before Hagrid, the job rotated through groundskeepers with varying degrees of enthusiasm for herding nervous 11-year-olds toward boats in the dark. Hagrid has done it with consistent delight for 3 decades. The boats cross. The castle comes into view. Every child who has ever made that crossing has a memory of the first time they saw it. The specific arrangement of lights, the towers against the sky, the reflection in the loch, the memory stays. Years later, in the lives they go on to build, the crossing surfaces. In moments of difficulty, in moments of joy, in moments that feel like endings or beginnings. They did not know, when they were 11 and looking up at a lit castle from a boat on a Scottish loch, that they were making a memory they would keep for the rest of their lives. They were too busy feeling everything. The school opens its doors. The Sorting Hat sings. Another year begins. This is where the story will always be, at the beginning, on the water, in the dark, with the lights ahead. 1,000 years of children have crossed that loch. 1,000 years more will cross it. The ceiling will show whatever sky there is. The staircases will move in their patterns. The portraits will watch. The library will hold its books. The room will be there when someone needs it badly enough. And if you have come this far tonight, if the founders and their falling out and the centuries of headmasters and the quiet long history of a castle in Scotland have carried you to the edge of sleep, then that's what the castle does. Anne. It holds you, it keeps going, it gives you somewhere to put your attention, while the rest of your body does the work it needs to do in the dark. The story will be here when you wake up. The loch is still. The squid is somewhere below, moving slowly in old water. The forest is dark and full of things going about their business, without any interest in being watched. Let everything settle. Let the castle do what it does. If this is where sleep found you, somewhere between a Scottish plateau 1,000 years ago and the sound of boats crossing a dark loch, that's exactly where it was supposed to. There are more hours like this one waiting. The complete history of the Ministry of Magic, the full lore of the Deathly Hallows, the untold decades before Harry Potter's parents were born, every headmaster in depth, the lives the Hogwarts graduates went on to build, all of it, told slowly, with no reason to rush. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Every video on this channel is a long story, told at the pace your mind needs at the end of the day. The next one will be there when you need it. Sleep well. The castle keeps watch.